the diamond belt selection? Elder Low could not help but be taken aback by Ezra's request. The former soon frowned, somewhat hesitant as he said, "Ezra, I know you are strong, but you have to participate in the diamond belt selection as an alchemist from Alchemic Rune Peak, not any martial master. Isn't it a little too soon for you to participate? You have a lot of time." The diamond belt selection was a major event in the spirit-devouring mountain. This was because diamond belt disciples were the most elite disciples of the Outer and were often the ones who went on to become the backbone of the sect. Therefore, every diamond belt selection was extremely stringent and personally attended by not only several peak elders, but also the peak masters on occasion. Even elders like Elder Low were unable to approve the promotion to the diamond belt. All they could do was nominate their disciples for the selection and pray for their success. Furthermore, there were a limited number of promotions available each cycle. As such, the participants were basically composed of the first seat gold belt disciples from each peak, making the competition extremely intense. To be blunt, even someone like Kimba, who was the #1 gold belt disciple under Elder Song, was not considered top tier amongst all the factions in the entire Outer Mountains. Thus, Elder Low felt it was a little too early for Ezra Zephyr to participate in the diamond belt selection. Nonetheless, he believed that given Ezra's talent and potential, it would be better to pass the selection after half a year. In Elder Low's eyes, Ezra was a genius alchemist. He was afraid that if he showed too much of his fighting talent, then he would be stolen by other peaks, just like how Govern was snatched by Arcane Wizardry Peak. Ezra, there are only 10 diamond belt promotions available for the upcoming selection test, while close to 100 disciples will be taking part. It will be extremely competitive, every one of them would be at peak core formation stage. Elder Low sighed as he tried to talk Ezra out of it. The prince merely smiled in response and said, "Elder Low, I just want to give it a shot. There's no loss even if I fail, right?" Though he was wearing a smile, his words were filled with absolute confidence. 2 diamond belt selection tests were held every year, and the upcoming one was already the second one for the year. If he missed it, there would no longer be any chance for him to become a diamond belt disciple this year. As a result, he would be unable to participate in the peak chief disciple selection trial. At the sight of Ezra's determination, Elder Low smiled in resignation and said, "You're too impatient." In the end, he could only sigh as he nodded and said, "Fine, if that's what you want, go ahead and give it a shot. If you lose, treat it as preparation for the next test. No VLBN. After all, there is nothing to be ashamed of if you fail." Many disciples have participated in several diamond belt selection tests, only to fail over and over again. He looked at the prince as he continued, "The next diamond belt selection is in 2 months. You must work hard during these 2 months, and cannot neglect your training. I will nominate you for the upcoming selection test." "Thank you, Elder Low." Satisfaction appeared on Ezra's face when he heard this. Elder Low helplessly shook his head. However, there was some pride and happiness in his eyes. Youngsters should be passionate and ambitious. If he didn't even have a little drive, how could he possibly hope to tackle the dangerous and arduous road of alchemy? Since he wants to try, I'll let him have his chance. After all, this young has always been quite surprising. What if he actually succeeds? If that happened, even peak masters would take notice, bringing the spotlight to their nearly forgotten faction. In fact, peak masters may even let them have a few gifted disciples next time. Compared to the previous gold quarter, the new diamond quarter was several times larger. The quarter seemed to reach all the way into the heart of the mountain, monopolizing practically all of its spiritual energy. A little stream flowed within the quarter, rays of sunlight shined from above, transforming into countless shimmering specks of light that illuminated the interior, making it appear as if dust was dancing within. Boundless spiritual energy gushed out from an aperture at the deepest part of the quarter, transforming into a thin mist that swirled inside, making the air feel extremely refreshing. The natural spiritual energy here was much denser than the gold quarter. There was even a large herb garden at one corner of the quarter that was filled with all kinds of mysterious plants. Flowers breathed spiritual energy, filling the place with a variety of exotic smells. These aromas had the effect of calming the mind and increasing concentration, making them quite beneficial for one's training. However, the one most pleased with this new accommodation was not Ezra Zephyr, but SK, LL and Hattie. They seemed to have a special fondness for the herb garden, spending every day leisurely sleeping in the garden. In the depths of the quarter, near the spiritual energy aperture, the prince sat cross-legged on a sizable rock, with eyes lightly shut. A scarlet-red crystal hovered in front of him, specks of light glimmering brightly inside like the sun, as an alarming heat spread. It was the 9 suns crystal required to practice the sun god memoir. The prince cupped the crystal with both hands, feeling as if he was holding the sun or the moon. Small bolts of black lightning rose from his palms and battered against the crystal, slowly grinding it like a grindstone. As the 9 suns crystal was grinded by spiritual energy, grains of crystal dust began to fall off. Merging with Ezra's spiritual energy, the spiritual energy ultimately tunneled back into Ezra's hands and flowed into his core. It was fairly complicated to learn a top-level martial technique. One needed to continuously combine various resources with one's own spiritual energy, while attempting time and time again to achieve a certain equilibrium, before gradually stabilizing the newly created composition. This step alone had thwarted numerous practitioners, causing them to waste countless resources. Moreover, every failure would consume a portion of the resources and their spiritual energy. Thankfully, Ezra had the monstrous wolf of Norse, Fenrir. With his help, he was able to determine how much of each resource he had to mix with his spiritual energy, allowing him to minimize wastage. Even so, he still needed some time to flawlessly create a spiritual technique mark and brand it into his core. After an unknown period of time, the prince finally opened his tightly shut eyes as he slowly spat out a breath of air. He lowered his head and looked at his palm, only to realize that the 9 suns crystal had shrunk by 1/3. At this rate, as long as nothing unexpected happens, I should be able to start forming the mark after a month. There was no smile on Ezra's lips. He was not pleased with his progress. "Don't be hasty, kid, you are already faster than geniuses," said Fenrir. "I know, Fenrir," he replied and stretched his waist, causing all the bones in his body to crack and pop. He let out a relaxed sigh as he inhaled the faint flowery fragrance in the quarter. He had been exceedingly low-key for the past 10 days or so. As a result, the commotion he caused due to the quarter match gradually began to die down. After all, a quarter match between gold belt disciples would not continue spreading forever. The prince also did not enjoy being in the limelight, and much rather preferred quietly growing stronger and building plans. However, he knew that news of his nomination by Elder Lowe for the diamond belt selection would soon begin to spread sometime during the next 2 days. This would likely cause another commotion again. Just as Ezra stood up, he suddenly felt some activity at the entrance. His senses reached out and found 2 persons standing in front of the quarter, unable to enter due to the barrier. The round and fat figure naturally belonged to Gil Subzi, and the lanky youth was Tsunzutun, the 2 most talented subordinates of Ezra in Alchemic Rune Peak. The prince walked towards the entrance, dispersing the barrier with a wave of his hand. When Gil saw Ezra walk out, he bounced forward with a grin as he fished out a scroll from his sleeve and said, "Your Majesty, I have completed the task you set me. This scroll contains the details of all the disciples who will be participating in the upcoming diamond belt selection." He clicked his tongue before continuing, "However, none of these fellows are pushovers. Practically all of them stand at the peak of the gold belt disciples in their groups, and every single one is superior to Kimba. Your Majesty, are you really going to take part?" He awkwardly scratched his head as he said in an uneasy manner, "From what I know, no slightly over a month-old Outer Mountain disciple from our spirit-devouring mountain has ever had the guts to take part in the diamond belt selection." Ezra smirked, but he did not answer the question. Instead, he slowly unraveled the scroll in his hand. His eyes narrowed slightly as he looked at their names and data. "Oh. They haven't disappointed me." 2 months later. The day of the diamond belt selection arrived. The entire spirit-devouring Mountai seemed to fall into a frenzy, the atmosphere so infectious that even the surrounding spiritual energy seemed to stir excitedly. Although the participating disciples were only a tiny fraction of the entire sect, it did not stop the diamond belt selection from becoming one of the grandest occasions in the sect. In fact, the attention drawn by this event was second only to the year-end ranking battle. After all, though the disciples may not be qualified to participate now, that day would eventually come, and this selection would be the path they would have to take to be promoted. Diamond Belt disciples were the true elites and backbone of the spirit-devouring sect's outer mountains, while also the goal every disciple worked hard towards. After becoming a Diamond Belt disciple, one's treatment and status would far surpass the other disciples, becoming the envy of everyone. Hence, it was not strange for the Diamond Belt disciple to garner so much attention. Colleen Evil Peak. Prepared and ready, the disciples' eyes could not help but brighten when they saw three beauties walk out of the quarter. The one leading was Ella Abella. She was wearing a light green top and trousers today, the trousers lightly hugging her tiny waist while making her legs appear exceptionally long and slender. Her usually unbound hair was currently tied up behind her head, revealing her fair and graceful neck that seemed to glow under the light. The second was Ravina Ingale. Dressed as she always did, she wore a tight red dress, revealing her slender figure. Her eyes were burning with passion, she had the commitment. The last lady was Mahi Ingale, the sweet chubby lady who wore tight trousers, showcasing her otherworldly curves. She looked like a maiden of heaven, sweet, smiling and sexy. So pretty. The fellow female disciples were not stingy with their praise. However, Ella was completely unaffected, her red lips opening slightly as she said, "How's the progress of you two gone?" "It's very satisfying, senior sister," said Mahi. Ravina didn't look at Ella and replied, "I'll win, you don't have to worry." Rude and straight, that's how Ravina Ingale was. Ella stayed silent and slowly opened her mouth. "Any news of Ezra?" Mahi's face instantly turned gloomy as she awkwardly said, "We are still in the search phase, no one knows where he went." Ravina instantly interrupted. "Are you worried about Ezra?" "Haha, a sheep trying to save the wolf. Ezra is strong and cunning at that, he must be planning for a carnage." At this point, Mahi could not help but bite her tongue. The prince went missing all of a sudden, 2 months ago, and nobody heard the news of him. Ravina saw the worry on her cousin's face, the corners of her red lips raising slightly as she said, "Are you properly prepared for the diamond belt selection?" Mahi flinched as she was lost and nodded with a smile of confidence. "Don't worry, I'm also itching to see what Blood Slaughterer Peak's meticulous planning and efforts will amount to. The news has spread that Wilson Sallow and fanatics of Sith Wiggins have planned to kill the prince under the shade of a mistake in this diamond belt selection." This news ignited the hate and anger inside the Bloodfang army, and these two Ingale sisters were also part of that army. They had invested much thought and effort into removing him in the diamond belt selection, obviously because Ezra was a huge threat. Hence, whatever tricks they had would soon be revealed today. Ravina gave a slight nod. The trio walked out of the quarter, riding on a spiritual energy cloud as they arrived on one of the mountains. At this current moment, practically all of the disciples from different every peak were there. Alchemic Rune Peak's 2 factions were gathered as well. In a grand event like the Diamond Belt selection, even peak elders and the peak masters would be present. Hence, the elders of the various factions would bring all of their disciples to watch. This was why the 2 elders Lo and Song and their disciples were already here. In the middle of all, a loud thunderclap echoed in the sky. Even the elders were inveigled to look. They saw a black bird, flapping its wings. That's Ezra Zephyr." "What? Ezra? How is he flying?" Boom. With a slight jerk of the shoulder, the 2 lightning-made wings shattered with a blast as the prince fell onto the hill. He stood and smiled at the masses, his black coat fluttered in the air, and all eyes were glued to him. The werewolf caused quite a stir the moment he appeared. After all, he was in a sense the most well-known disciple of the newest generation. Elder Lo's disciples greeted him with warm gaze, Mubarak and gang quickly crowding over like stars around the moon. Mubarak candidly said, "Haha, Junior brother Ezra, I've placed quite a big bet of 5,000 spirit jade pieces on you this time. You've got to do your best or I'll be going hungry next month. I've also put my entire fortune of 2,000 spirit jade pieces on you. Your Majesty, how big I shall make it depends on you," said Gil Subzi with a flattering smile, his chubby face giving off an oily gleam. The other disciples also laughed along, declaring how much they had bet one after another. Ezra smirked as he nodded to everyone. As his reputation grew step by step during the last 5 months in the spirit-devouring sect, Alchemic Rune Peak's disciples gradually began to accept him and were now much more respective. The talent and battle achievements Ezra had racked up had convinced them of his abilities, dispersing the feeling of unfairness they had previously towards his preferential treatment. Of course, this was with the exception of Elder Song and his disciples. The disciples from the other faction looked over with complicated expressions. A majestic mountain range towered across the land, the mountains separated by giant snaking rivers. Mist swirled around the mountains, giving them a solemn and grand aura. This mountain range was the location of the Diamond Belt selection and was known as the Diamond Mountains. It has also become the busiest place in the entire spirit-devouring mountain today. Countless glowing figures seemed to fill the sky as they landed on the mountains in the vicinity of the Diamond Mountains, causing the spacious land to become rather crowded and noisy. The popularity of the Diamond Belt selection was evidently far from ordinary. A spiritual energy cloud descended from the sky, landing on one of the mountain tops. Elder Lo waved his sleeve, dispersing the spiritual energy as the figures of numerous disciples were revealed, Ezra Zephyr and Gil Subzi included among them. The group were quite excited as they gazed upon the lively spectacle. An occasion as grand as this only occurred a few times a year after all. Is this the venue of the Diamond Belt selection? Ezra lifted his gaze to observe the majestic, unbroken mountain range. Ancient trees towered within the extremely lush foliage, which was also blanketed by a layer of mist, giving the place a somewhat mysterious air. That's right, this place is known as the Diamond Mountains, and every Diamond Belt selection will take place here. Elder Lo stood beside Ezra, his normally strict and stern old face filled with a smile when he looked towards his disciple. One could tell that Ezra's surprising achievements made Elder Lo treat the former as a treasure. All of the participants will be sent into this mountain range to compete for victory. The prince nodded. Looks like the Diamond Belt selection was a free-for-all brawl of sorts, making it much more exciting than the one-on-one bracket-type duels, because it represents chaos and the lack of rules, the true image of spirit-devouring mountain. Everything would be for the sake of obtaining victory in the end. Ezra, there are not many rules for the Diamond Belt selection, and all kinds of tactics can be employed. The sect won't say much as long as lives aren't threatened. Elder Lo looked towards Ezra and cautioned, after all, the sect does not wish to nurture disciples that purely have strength without wit and tactic. The prince nodded in agreement. The disciples in the sect did not face much danger, but there was a fate-deciding war with Dua Mountain Peak half a year away. The situation in the Naren continent was complicated, and even the disciples of a titan like the spirit-devouring mountain would encounter numerous dangers outside. If all one had was recklessness, one would not survive for long. However, such chaos would also make it even more uncertain and dangerous for him. Especially knowing that senior disciples would be targeting him. Ezra, I know that you are eager, but there are many strong opponents. My advice to you is not to fight. Your work is a masterpiece, and you are a God-gifted genius of alchemy. I know and I have seen that you are as good of a martial master as you are an alchemist, but please don't risk your life. The Peak Master, Master Shims, has seen your scroll. You have already qualified for this test. The prince grinned and shook his head. Elder Lo, keep believing in me. You also want Alchemic Rune Peak on top of other peaks, no? Elder Lo didn't wait a second and replied, no. Nothing is more important to me than your well-being. Ezra was taken aback. He looked at the old alchemy teacher who treated him like his son. His goal to become atrocious was wavering. He turned his head and replied. But I want to see it. Elder Lo sighed. All right, stubborn youth. At least, do not aim for champion, but take success as managing to rank amongst the top 10. The prince smiled and nodded. Don't worry, Elder Low, I will naturally take a step back if the situation does not bode well and give up on vying for first. Elderly nodded and lowered his head to Ezra's ear. Come back sooner, I am eager to know how you spent 2 months in Forgotten Forest. The prince chuckled. Elder Low laughed back and tapped his shoulder before pointing towards the misty mountain range as he said, there are 10 peaks in the depths of the Diamond Mountains. The 10 individuals who manage to ascend these 10 peaks will be the top 10. A thoughtful look rose on Ezra's face. Then how will the champion be decided? Elder Low answered, you guys will only find out after ascending the 10 mountains, because it may be different from the past selections. The prince nodded. He had nothing more to ask. Not long after they arrived, a spiritual energy cloud suddenly descended from the sky. A white skirt fluttered in the wind, revealing Ella Abella's figure. She directly landed next to Ezra, immediately causing countless burning gazes to look over. Behind her were Ravina and Mahi. These 3 were after all the top beauties of the outer mountains of the spirit-devouring mountain, and just the sight of them standing together would make one's heart beat a little faster. Ella paid no heed to these gazes. She gave a light bow to Elder Low, who was standing next to Ezra, as she said, I'm afraid that things will be difficult for you during this selection. Ezra did not comment, merely continuing to sarcastically grin. Ella stared at Ezra's face and said, I can ask the Colleen Evil Peak disciples to aid him as repayment for the favor you did me. How about it? Her prideful nature made her feel that she owed Ezra due to the energy reservoir affair. Hence, she was always trying to find a way to repay the former, to remove the discomfort she felt whenever she met Ezra. Ezra thought for a moment before he shook his head and leisurely said, which disciples? Ella pointed to Ravina and Mahi. These 2 are future geniuses of our peak, you should know them, they are from your batch, but NKW in this battle, every peak is the enemy of others. The prince nonchalantly replied. Do they need your permission to aid me? Ella Abella was puzzled. She knew that Ravina and Mahi were both close to Ezra, but she was sure that they would never disobey their senior. Her brows knitted together. Aren't you overestimating yourself too much? Do you know how many individuals are after you? Your Bloodfang army has fewer participants, and looks like they won't be much of a help anyways. So I'll have to depend on myself, said Ezra. Ella placed extra emphasis on her words as she said, don't act like a dullard and think, can you really challenge all of the first seat gold belt disciples from the various factions of all 6 peaks alone? Every single one of them is stronger than Kimba. She clearly felt that Ezra's earlier words were far too irresponsible. The former fell silent for a moment, before she said, do you believe that you can take on all 6, 1430 peaks? The former fell silent for a moment, before she said, do you believe that you can take on all 6 peaks? We'll know once I try. Anyhow, I'm the one that will be humiliated if I lose. Nothing for you to worry about, the prince seemed to smile as he spoke. Ella stared at Ezra's figure. In the end, she turned and moved away. Ravina and Mahi stood there and looked at Ezra. Ravina was curiously looking at Ezra, while Mahi's gaze was filled with affection. Soon after, they turned as well and followed Ella. One after another, spiritual energy clouds appeared carrying the disciples. A cloud landed and piercing eyes looked at Ezra. They were the disciples of Blood Slaughterer Peak. Another cloud appeared and landed beside the former, another faction of Blood Slaughterer Peak. Only one disciple was on that cloud along with a faction elder. The disciple bid farewell to his master and walked. The seniors of Blood Slaughterer Peak looked at him and smirked. So you are the new guy, I heard rumors of you. Hey, where are you going? The young disciple didn't stop until he reached where Ezra was. The young man kneeled. This lowly subject greets His Highness. This scene shook everyone, especially the disciples of Blood Slaughterer Peak. The prince reviewed Zulfi with his eyes and uttered, you have improved, Zulfi. The man was none other than Zulfi Dimitri. He upset his prince in the peak selection ceremony. Ever since then, he practiced like a maniac and dueled myriad of disciples in Blood Slaughterer Peak. I am not yet satisfied, Your Majesty. Nobody is perfect, Zulfi, not even me. Keep honing your sword and you may stand now. Zulfi bowed his head and stood up. Your Majesty, greetings. Your servant has arrived, Your Majesty. All hail Prince Ezra Zephyr. Just when Zulfi rose, 3 familiar figures appeared behind him and bowed. They were the Urgale Arms, Shapeshifter, and Argus Waska. The new batch geniuses of their respective peaks were participating as well. Ezra knew about their participation, and he showed the lists Zutton and Gil Subzi brought to him. The prince witnessed the drastic changes in their subordinates. They trained hard for the past 5 months. Master. Ezra heard something. He turned his head to the source of the voice. A slender man wearing a straw hat bowed. Greetings, Master. The prince nodded and said, You may rise now, XYR. All the leading figures of the Bloodfang faction were gathered. All the eyes of the disciples were fixated on this small squad. All of them were the leading geniuses of the new generation in their peaks. Out of all, the most famous other than Ezra were Zulfi Dimitrt and XYR. The former was famous for dueling every famous gold belt disciple. Even some diamond belt disciples tasted the flavor of defeat at his sword. As for the latter, XYR was an anomaly himself. Close-range fighting sorcerers are called dangerous, and XYR was one with dual martial spirits. When these two people saw each other, the temperature rose. Killing intent rose within Zulfi Dimitri. XYR felt the piercing gaze and released his spiritual energy. Have you guys forgotten my presence? A thunderous voice resounded. Both XYR and Zulfi flinched and quickly kneeled. I have sinned, Your Majesty. Please, punish me, said Zulfi. Master, your servant is ready for any punishment, XYR said. The prince looked at both and gave a slight nod. Stand up, do not create a weak image of yourself. Not controlling your anger is a weakness. I know both of you are like water and oil, but none of you is allowed to kill the other. You'll get your chance to duel, have patience. As you command, Your Majesty. This servant understood, Master. The prince smirked and moved. Let's see our competitors in person. The Blood Slaughterer Peak disciples were gathered on a giant mountain relatively close to the Diamond Mountains. At this time, Denise Tubble, Ajahn Pardo, and the gang had congregated at a certain location on the mountain peak. Denise's gaze was slightly cold as she looked towards a mountain in the distance where Ezra and the rest were currently standing. She gritted her teeth when she saw the promising Zulfi Dimitri of her peak standing behind Ezra like a loyal knight. I've heard that many disciples have bet on Ezra. Ajahn Pardo wore a faint smile beside her. He too cast his gaze towards Ezra as he playfully said, but that's fine, the higher their expectations, the greater their disappointment and anger when he falls. It is time for us to let this smooth-sailing junior brother of ours encounter a setback, so that he won't become too arrogant and feel that there's no one with ability in the outer mountains of our spirit-devouring mountain. Denise Tubble nodded, a surge of happiness flashing in her eyes. Looks like the bitter frustration and resentment she held in her heart for several months was finally going to be released. Junior brother Umar, we'll have to inconvenience you this time. Ajahn smiled at a young man beside him, who seemed to always wear a warm smile on his face, making him look extremely friendly and approachable. It was the first seat gold belt disciples of Blood Slaughterer Peak's master faction, Umar. Umar wore his usual smile as he said, I met Senior Brother Wilson Sallow last night. Senior Brother Wilson Sallow? Both Ajahn Pardo and Denise Tubble jumped at the mention of this name. This was the second chosen of their Blood Slaughterer Peak, the one who has the official ranking of third strongest disciple in Outer Mountains. Ajahn hastily asked, what did Senior Brother Wilson say? He told me that youngsters these days are too proud, and should be taught a little lesson. He assures us that we can do whatever we want. Umar grinned. Joy immediately surfaced in the eyes of Ajahn and Denise. They never imagined that even Senior Brother Wilson would stand on their side. It seems that Ezra had really stuck out too much recently. They were unaware that Wilson had a grudge of his own. With Wilson's words, there would no longer be any reservations in the hearts of the Blood Slaughterer Peak disciples. Ajin and Denise exchanged a look, and could not help but chuckle. Clang clan. The excitement in the vicinity of the Diamond Mountains grew more and more intense as time passed. The hot sun rose in the sky, hanging high above the land. It was at this moment that clanging suddenly began echoing across the place. Soon after, every disciple felt a grand aura descend from the sky, accompanied by an indescribable pressure that caused the land to tremble. Innumerable disciples raised their heads in reverence as they watched several glowing figures descend from the sky, ultimately landing on the highest mountain in the vicinity of the Diamond Mountains where several stone seats stood. The glowing figures seated themselves as the light faded, revealing their appearances. They were the mighty peak masters of 7 peaks of spirit-devouring mountain. Greetings, peak masters. All the disciples and elders bowed as they cupped their fists together. Master Antero faintly nodded with a smile. Soon after, his booming voice rang out. It is time. The disciples may enter the mountains. In the wake of his words, the entire place instantly erupted into noise. The long-awaited Diamond Belt selection had finally begun. The entire place seemed to explode when Peak Master Antero's booming voice sounded. Swish swish. Under the excited gazes of countless disciples, glowing figure after figure suddenly rose from the ground, flying past the Grand Winder rivers as they swarmed towards the misty mountain range. All of the participating disciples had begun moving at this moment, creating a rather grand sight. Ezra took in a deep breath as he watched this scene, feeling the blood in his body faintly beginning to boil under this atmosphere. Go get them, senior/junior brother Ezra! Yelled his surrounding fellow disciples to boost his morale. The prince was going to represent their faction after all, and if he managed to win, it would also make them well known in the sect. Ezra nodded towards the crowd and smiled. His gaze then turned towards Elder Lowe, as he sent a faint smile towards him. Ella Abella made a bet with me, so you'd better not end up shaming me. The corners of Ezra's mouth twitched as he helplessly shook his head. Without further ado, his foot pushed off the ground, sending his figure soaring into the air, transforming into a lightning silhouette that landed towards the misty mountain range. His 5 subordinates followed his back. On another peak far away, Denise coldly watched Ezra fly into the mountain range as she let out an icy chuckle. In the next instant, her figure also shot forth. Under the thunderous cheers all around, numerous disciples made their way into the arena. After they were in, spiritual energy began to gather in the sky above, transforming into many mirrors. The numerous participants could be seen in the mirrors, allowing the disciples outside to spectate. On a certain mountain peak, Ella Abella gazed at the mirrors, evidently searching for Ezra's figure. Upon seeing this, the several girls crowding around her broke into grins and said, "Senior Sister Ella, are you looking for Ezra again? Aren't you a little too concerned about him? What about other peak's disciples, can't you show them a little attention too?" Ella coldly rolled her eyes in response to their teasing, ignoring these talkative girls as she continued her search. At this moment, a group of males from Heavenly Fiend Peak disciples approached. A young man in blue robes was leading them, appearing quite handsome with his somewhat long and narrow eyes. Around his waist was a diamond belt, clearly revealing his status. Upon seeing him walk over, the eyes of the girls around Ella brightened as they called out, "Senior brother Licorice." Licorice was clearly quite famous in the sect and was an elite even amongst the diamond belt disciples. In addition, everyone knew that he was currently interested in Ella Abella. "Senior Sister Ella." Licorice displayed a faint smile at them before looking towards Ella. Ella swept a glance at him and nodded as she half-heartedly said, "Oh, it's junior brother Licorice." Her gaze returned to the spiritual energy mirrors, only pausing a few moments later when she found that familiar figure, as a smile appeared on her pretty face. Licorice followed her gaze as his eyes narrowed slightly. Junior brother Ezra might be in quite a pickle. I'm afraid that it will be unlikely for him to be ranked amongst the top 10. Ella didn't react, but her tone turned a little cold as she said, "Isn't junior brother Licorice being a little too presumptuous?" Licorice merely chuckled. "From what I know, the first agenda of the Blood Slaughterer Peak disciples led by Umar is to surround and eliminate Ezra. Does senior sister Ella believe that he has any chance against such a lineup? N.1b/in. Ella's expression changed slightly. She was only aware that Denise would be targeting Ezra, and never expected that the blood slaughterer Peeks would also be a part of this. Did Denise Tubble really command so much respect? Or, it's Wilson? She pondered. Lycris's smile grew when he saw Ella's expression change. There was a mocking look in his eyes as he turned towards the figure in the mirror, as he seemed to sincerely say, "Junior brother Ezra Zephyr is too brash. He's clearly just a new disciple, and yet he seems to love shamelessly basking in the limelight. It will be good for him to be taught a lesson now, since our fellow disciples will not take things too far. Otherwise, if he offends someone outside the sect in the future, the price he pays then will be much, much worse." Ella shot an icy look at him, anger erupted in her eyes. "No, senior sister." A fellow disciple spoke. Ella calmed down and decided to pay no attention to him as she walked away. The girl who stopped her came to Lycris and uttered, "You a diamond belt and she is a top ranker of Colleen Evil Peak. Keep poking her that way and one day you'll die a miserable death, and let me be clear, not even your uncle, who is an elder in Heavenly Fiend Peak, can save your sorry ass that day." Lycris's face turned red, he wanted to curse but couldn't. Ezra's figure penetrated the mist, landing on the vast mountain range. The mist partially obstructed his vision, making his surroundings appear rather hazy. However, he was still clearly able to sense several spiritual energy undulations nearby. Participants, the 10 peaks are located in the depths of this mountain range and are locked behind stone doors. To open these doors, you will need to acquire 20 marks to use as a key. To obtain a mark, you will need to either defeat one of the other participants or search for the mark hidden in Diamond Mountain. Thus, for the sake of obtaining the mark to ascend the 10 peaks, go forth and do whatever you want. You will be teleported out of the Diamond Mountain once you accept your defeat. A death is less likely to happen, but a crippling injury is common, so be prepared. Peak Master Antero's voice thundered across the mountains after Ezra and the rest entered. Death is less likely to happen? Ezra's eyes narrowed when he heard this. In other words, it was the permission to kill. One can murder another before he accepts his defeat. This was the condition Ezra liked the most. "All of you, go back to your faction members and make sure to get a place in the top 10 peaks," Ezra ordered the 5 subordinates who followed him. "My liege, it's dangerous to be alone," said the prince looked at him over his shoulder. "Now you will protect me?" The flinched. "I apologize, but..." "Enough, don't ruin my fun. We'll meet at 10 peaks. Go." The prince said and sped up, the 5 subordinates scattered as well. After all, those who could participate in the selection were not ordinary individuals. One would likely have to go through a tough battle in order to obtain a single mark. Hence, most will look for the hidden mark. As expected of the Diamond Belt selection, the difficulty is pretty crazy for a normal disciple. Ezra smiled. However, there was no fear in his eyes, but instead a burning eagerness. This Diamond Belt selection was the perfect opportunity to create a carnage. BBZZZ. Amidst this, he could sense berserk spiritual energy explosions occurring in the mountain range, a sign that the battles had already begun. The rules announced by Peak Master Antero pitted the numerous disciples against each other, causing intense fights to break out almost immediately. The prince did not linger any further. With a push of his foot, his figure shot towards the depths of the mountain range. Swish. Ezra's toes brushed past a tree branch when he sensed something. Boom. Berserk spiritual energy exploded above him, followed by a roar. One could only watch as a figure appeared, ferocious spiritual energy sweeping towards the prince like a storm. This person had been hiding, waiting for an opportunity to launch a sneak attack when someone else came along. The powerful attack loomed towards him, but not a single ripple could be seen in Ezra's eyes. His 5 fingers swiftly formed a fist as a punch was sent towards the figure descending from above. Bong. A wave of spiritual energy swept outwards, snapping the surrounding tree trunks. Ezra's figure had not budged from the spot, only the branch below his feet swaying a little. The one that had attacked from above, however, let out a groan as he was sent flying backwards. He quickly turned around to escape, knowing that he had encountered a tough foe. Ezra did not intend to let this individual off. His figure instantly turned ethereal, appearing right behind the fleeing figure like a wisp of smoke. "Please no, Forgy." The figure instantly cried out in horror. However, Ezra's expression remained calm. Spiritual energy surged in his body as a black lightning-covered fist mercilessly slammed into the figure's back like thunder. Crackle. The figure was sent miserably tumbling forward, smearing a 100-foot-long track on the ground as he vomited a mouthful of blood. There was a visible hole in his back. Black lightning could be seen messing his spinal cord. A ray of light fell from the sky, sweeping up the figure and throwing him into the chasm. He had clearly been disqualified and teleported, but that injury was life-threatening. Ezra made a grabbing motion with his hand, causing a thumb-sized glowing mark to emerge from the direction the figure had been thrown in. The mark shot towards the prince, branding itself on the back of his hand. 1 mark obtained. The corners of Ezra's lips lifted slightly as he looked at the faintly glowing seal on the back of his hand. 19 more. His figure faintly etherealized, turning into smoke that darted forward. At this current time, battles were erupting all over the vast mountain range, burst after burst of spiritual energy exploding here and there, making the place appear exceptionally busy. It was a lively start to the Diamond Belt selection. Boom. A wave of berserk spiritual energy suddenly exploded within the dense forest, tearing up the surrounding ground as thick tree after tree was snapped at their waist. A space had been cleared in the forest, Ezra standing in the middle of the crumbled ground, as a disciple fell facing the sky some distance to his front. His face was hollowed by a punch. Within a blink, he was swept up by a ray of light. A glowing mark landed on Ezra's fist. He now had 4 marks. 16 more. The prince frowned. He had been searching for disciples for quite some time, only to realize that the disciples from the other 6 peaks had begun to group up in 2s and 3s to guard against the other peaks for the time being. This made it harder for him to kill. After all, none of the other participants were small fries, and if they were too, they would get enough space to surrender. What's more, he hasn't found any of the Blood Slaughterer Peak participants at all times. It was at a time like this that the pitiful state of Alchemic Rune Peak was revealed. The participants from the other 6 peaks numbered in the dozens. Ezra Zephyr secretly shook his head. A competition like this was far too disadvantageous for Alchemic Rune Peak, and it was already pretty amazing for them to have 1 or 2 new Diamond Belt disciples each year. "Hey, bastard! Come out." While various thoughts swirled in Ezra's head, he sighed and his eyes suddenly moved as he abruptly wheeled towards the forest on his right. He picked a stone, engulfed it with black lightning, and threw it. Boom. Deadly spiritual energy swept out from the forest, deflecting the stone with a bang. The giant tree in the vicinity was caught in the aftershock, crashing to the ground. The prince looked over, only to find a young man holding a sword with a green edge. The spiritual energy around him was extremely strong and vigorous, while also exceedingly sharp, a sign that he had a weapon-based martial spirit. The young man's sword was slanted downwards at his side as he smiled at Ezra Zephyr and said, "Hee, I'm only passing by my junior brother." The prince glanced at the back of the young man's hand and saw 3 marks. This excited him a little. To think that this fellow had also managed to get 3 marks. The way he acted showed that he didn't find the 3 hidden marks, but defeated 3 disciples. "You're from Blood Slaughter Peak?" asked Ezra as he clenched. "Blood Slaughterer Peak, Sean." The young man nodded with a smile. "You've been following me for some time," said the prince. The truth was that he had already faintly sensed that someone was secretly tailing him since earlier. This someone was likely this Sean. Sean nodded again upon hearing this. "You're trying to delay me?" asked the prince. A playful smile seemed to rise from the corners of Sean's mouth as he stared at Ezra and nonchalantly said, "Delay you? Junior brother Ezra, you think too highly of yourself. Although senior brother Umar has his own plan, I feel that you do not have the qualifications to make so many of our talented blood slaughter peak disciples come to deal with you. That's why I'm revealing myself now." A dazzling radiance surged on his sword as he slowly raised it to point at Ezra Zephyr. There was a sharp and proud look in the young man's eyes as he said, "After I take care of you by myself, Senior Brother Umar will understand that his plan is unnecessary." Swish. However, the instant the words left his mouth, Ezra's etherealized body had already shot forward, leaving images in the air as he dashed towards Sean. "What the?" Surprise and fury flashed in Sean's eyes upon seeing that Ezra clearly showed no concern for his words, and had instead chosen to ignore them and attack. In Sean's eyes, his opponent was obviously looking down on him. Sean's foot violently slammed into the ground as a wave of sharp spiritual energy unfurled from his body, instantly tearing deep gashes in the ground around him. Sharp chi swam through the air like fish, heading straight for Ezra Zephyr. The prince saw the attack and mumbled another side character to die, N0 Velb 1N. The prince was quicker, leaving an afterimage behind as the spiritual energy landed on empty air. His gaze locked onto Sean. The prince knew that the blood slaughterer peak disciples were definitely rushing here, he was dragging the battle for them to come. The rage in Sean's eyes intensified at the sight of the menacingly approaching Ezra Zephyr. The sword in his hand suddenly shuddered as a sword cry rang out. Vigorous spiritual energy poured into it, causing countless rays of sword light to explode from its body as deadly power pulsed. Lightsful, even a 6th-level disciple would have to retreat in the face of such power. However, the black coat fluttered and appeared on Ezra's body to protect him. This attack doesn't need Ezra to activate Dragon Pelt. Sean icily chuckled as the sword in his hand thrust forward. It instantly split apart the space before him like lightning flashing through the night sky with unstoppable momentum. The sword light was reflected in Ezra's pupils, but not a single change could be seen on his face. Not only did he not move to avoid the deadly strike, but instead, he even extended a hand to grab it. He was going to receive it with his bare hands. Stupid bastard. Sean's eyes hardened. His sword attack could cut even a mountain. To think that Ezra dared to receive it with his bare hands. Soon, the sword and hand touched. At the instant of contact, the silver wolf-shaped pauldron suddenly wriggled in liquid form and wrapped around Ezra's hand like a silver glove. It was one of the armaments from the Fenrir. Grade 4 Spiritual Rune, Hand of Lightning Demon. A spiritual rune suddenly brightened on Ezra's palm as a peculiar ripple spread. Lightning emerged, bathing the hand covered in silver glove in a white thundering gleam. As if it was a hand made from solid lightning. Crackle. The lightning hand reached out and grabbed the sword light, its sharp blade grating against his palm, creating a shower of sparks. However, no matter how the sword light struggled, it was unable to cut through Ezra's multiple defensive layers. Shock surfaced in Sean's eyes. He could not believe that the prince had really caught the sword with his bare hands. Moreover, he had even made Sean's invasive sword-like spiritual energy lose its effect. Shing. Ezra's lightning hand slipped down the sword as his ethereal figure rapidly approached Sean's shrinking pupils. Boom. White lightning swirled around Ezra's silver-gloved fist as it mercilessly slammed into Sean's gut. This punch directly scattered the flowing spiritual energy in Sean's body. With the spiritual energy, his body now scattered, his body curled in pain as he turned deathly pale, and his internal organs were destroyed. He never imagined that in a single exchange, Ezra would find an opening to scatter his spiritual energy with a punch, causing him to lose all his battle power. The prince chuckled as he gazed at the disbelief on Sean's face before he calmly said, "The truth is that you should have listened to your senior brother Umar. Wanting to take me on alone to gain glory, you're still too naive, piece of shit." A ray of light fell from the sky, wrapping around Sean. The instant he was being sent away, however, a jade pendant suddenly shattered at Sean's waist, scattering a fragrance that rushed towards the prince. Ezra rapidly backed away, but some of it still managed to touch him. The prince sniffed his body, finding an extremely faint but hard-to-remove fragrance. This caused him to frown slightly for a moment, before quickly turning around to dash into the dense forest. Seems like Blood Slaughterer Peak is adamant about killing me, oh boy, the prince grinned. As Ezra left, he did not know that the battle he had swiftly ended would cause a commotion outside the mountain range. The atmosphere was flooded with excitement outside the misty mountain range, with numerous disciples staring excitedly at the sky, where intense battles were being projected by every mirror. The ones who had the qualifications to participate in the Diamond Belt selection test were basically the elite Gold Belt disciples in the Spirit-Devouring Mountain, who possessed fairly high status. Therefore, when all of these individuals were gathered together for a competition, the fights between them were so exciting that most disciples were unable to turn away. Splash! Disciples were continuously swept up by beams of light and tossed into the winding river around the mountain range. Those were the disciples that had been eliminated. Wow! Senior Sister Elna from Arcane Wizardry Peak is truly incredible. She had already gotten 5 seals. Senior Sister Ravina and Mahi from Colleen Evil Peak have obtained 5 seals as well. There's also Senior Brother Umar from Blood Slaughterer Peak. TSK, it's no wonder they are the top Gold Belt disciple amongst the various factions of their respective peaks. Their battle achievements are truly astonishing. They are very powerful indeed. The rest of the disciples are still somewhat lacking compared to them. Many disciples spiritedly discussed amongst themselves as they watched the spiritual energy mirrors. N, Uveled 1N. There were also disciples who had their attention on Ezra. When they looked towards his spiritual energy mirror, cries of surprise suddenly rang out. Is that Senior Brother Sean from Blood Slaughterer Peak? I can't believe he bumped into Ezra so early. Their words instantly drew the attention of numerous individuals. The numerous disciples broke out into whispers when they saw the 2 individuals facing each other in the spiritual energy mirror. To think that he would run into Senior Brother Sean. This will be an interesting battle. Yeah. Even amongst the many Blood Slaughterer Peak Gold Belt disciples, Senior Brother Sean can be ranked amongst the top 3, and is definitely an extraordinary fellow. Agreed. I have been watching Senior Brother Sean's battles since earlier, and he has already defeated 3 disciples. Heh, didn't Ezra defeat 4 opponents earlier? However, it seems that he has finally run into a tough opponent. Defeat? He killed them, none of them survived after. Teleportation. He murdered 3 disciples, what monster this cursed generation has brought. The disciples gulped, and now half of them started to worry about Sean. The duel between Ezra and Sean was obviously going to be an interesting one, and it immediately drew the attention of more and more disciples as news of their clash quickly spread. Ella was also alerted, causing her to frown a little. She had naturally heard of Sean and was well aware that he was quite a formidable individual. She never expected that he would be the first Blood Slaughterer Peak disciple Ezra encountered. It seems like Junior Brother Ezra's luck is not very good. Beside Ella, the senior brother named Lycris narrowed his eyes slightly and remarked with a sarcastic smile. More importantly, Umar, Denise Tubble and the other Blood Slaughterer Peak disciples are all heading towards him. If Ezra allows himself to be tied down by Sean, it will only be a matter of time before he'll be trapped. Ella coldly glared at him. Though she didn't retort, her hands could not help but clench tightly. Ezra was indeed in a tough spot. Ezra, you must not die. Oh, are they about to start? Lycris suddenly chuckled while fixed on the spiritual energy mirror. Derision appeared on Lycris's lips as he said, "Haha, what a brave fellow. He actually dares to use his bare fist to meet Sean's sword? Doesn't he know that the spiritual energy of the Blood Slaughterer Peak disciples is the sharpest in our spirit-devouring mountain?" He had just seen Ezra extend his arm and grab the sword. Gasps immediately erupted from the numerous surrounding disciples. Some of the female disciples even shut their eyes as if anticipating that Ezra's palm would be sliced apart. Ella's face also turned a little pale. The mocking smile on Lycris's lips grew. He stared intently at the spiritual energy mirror, eagerly waiting to see Ezra's miserable fate. Under his intense stare, all of the disciples watched Ezra's grade 4 rune palm of lightning demon turn in a flash, before grabbing the sword. His hand slid down the sword, causing sparks to fly. Not even a single drop of blood could be seen. Next, Ezra instantly closed the distance between him and Sean and quickly delivered a punch packed with power into the latter's gut. The fight came to an abrupt end. The expression of numerous disciples immediately froze at this moment, staring in disbelief as Sean slowly crumpled to the ground. It was only a single punch. Sean, the third most powerful gold belt disciple from Blood Slaughterer Peak, was defeated just like that? Loud gulping sounds were heard one after another. It was completely different from the outcome they had imagined. The derisive smile on Lycras's face froze little by little. Soon after, the corners of his lips twitched as he exclaimed, "How is this possible? How could he have received Sean's sword with his bare hands?" Given Sean's strength, even someone as strong as Kimba would only end up getting cut if he were to try and receive the attack with his bare hands. So how did this new guy do it? Beside him, Ella heaved a deep sigh of relief, before shooting him an indifferent look. Even though she didn't utter a single word, the mocking expression in her eyes was enough to make Lycras's face instantly turn red with embarrassment. He had been mocking Ezra just a moment ago. In the blink of an eye, however, his words returned to slap him in the face. "Junior brother Lycras, if you want to watch, it wouldn't hurt for you to remain quiet and keep your remarks to yourself," said Ella Abella in a calm manner. Her words, however, were extremely merciless, showing no respect for Lycras's dignity. Lycras's face was an angry mixture of white and green. However, he did not dare to do anything to Ella, and had no choice but to swallow his anger. His dark gaze glared at Ezra's figure in the mirror as he secretly swore, "What's there to be happy about? When Umar shows up, you will be in for a good time." Ella smiled. "That's exactly what those who ate dust by his hands said as well." On the mountain peak where Elder Lowe and his disciples were standing, a wave of cheers immediately exploded from them when they saw this scene. They had previously been worrying their hearts out for Ezra Zephyr. However, Elder Lowe was astounded. His head turned to where Elder Song was as he sent a message through telepathy, a power used by Foundation establishment experts. "Elder Song, did you see that?" The elder of the Imprint faction who wanted to defeat Ezra was baffled as well. "Yes, how did he use a grade 4 rune?" At this moment, Elder Lowe saw regret in Elder Song's eyes. He was condemning every moment that created a distance between him and Ezra. The Elder of Alchemy smiled. "Elder Song, I have a proposal." No VELB1N. Near Elder Lowe, James Endoro withdrew his gaze and said, "That was very decisive of Ezra. The fact that he dared to use his bare palm against a Blood Slaughterer Peak disciple is proof of his bravery." Mubarak heard it and boastfully replied, "Just a small fry." James could not help but be startled by these words. He was a little upset as he said, "From what angle he looked like a small fry to you, I'm afraid that it won't be the same for Ezra." Sean likely wasn't expecting Ezra to pull off such a stunt. Otherwise, he wouldn't have been defeated by a single blow. Moreover, even though he defeated Sean, he has now been marked by the enchanting fragrance from Sean's pendant, a fragrance unique to Blood Slaughterer Peak. Hence, I believe that every Blood Slaughterer Peak disciple will soon track him down. When that happens, he will be in huge trouble. TCH, a situation where a single person takes on all of the disciples from one of the peaks has never happened before in our spirit-devouring mountain. Mubarak fell into thought for a while, before she earnestly said, "Well, he is not alone." James Endoro froze, he remembered the Bloodfang army. His eyes moved and landed on different mirrors and mumbled, "Those 5 are no less of monsters." Whoosh. In the midst of the dense forest, the prince's body was akin to a wisp of smoke as he dashed past, leaving faint afterimages in the space behind him. He was moving with astonishing speed. Though he could no longer smell the fragrance from his body, he could feel that he was being marked by an extremely faint and peculiar scent. The scent was extremely stubborn, making it nearly impossible for him to erase for the time being. His eyes rapidly scanned his surroundings. He knew that the Blood Slaughterer Peak disciples were forming an encirclement around him at this very moment. His scarlet eyes flickered faintly in thought as he muttered to himself, "Blood Slaughterer Peak, thanks for entertaining me, I'll take extra measures and prepare a big carnival for you." As his words faded, his figure had already flashed past, disappearing into the dense forest. Not long after Ezra's figure disappeared, the sound of rushing wind was heard as two figures landed on a thick tree branch. The pair consisted of a male and a female. Ummer and Denise Tubble, from Blood Slaughterer Peak. "He sure runs fast." Denise had an icy expression as she spoke. Ummer, on the other hand, wore his typical serious expression as he said, "It seems that he has noticed us." Denise frowned. Now that he's desperately running at full speed, it's going to be rather difficult to catch up. However, a panicked wild beast will always flee for its life. It will become easy pickings when it runs out of stamina. The other Blood Slaughterer Peak disciples have already formed a barricade around this area, and there is no way he can escape. Ummer concentrated on the smell and casually replied, "A cornered beast is as dangerous as a wounded one. You are underestimating him way too much, junior sister." Hearing that, Denise lowered her head, and she wore a gloomy expression. Seeing that, Ummer scratched his face and sighed, "My only concern is that it's quite shameful for so many of our talented Blood Slaughterer Peak disciples to deal with single Ezra Zephyr. However, I'm not very fond of surprises. Therefore, since I have already committed myself to this task, I will do everything I can to prevent any accidents from occurring, and destroy any glimmer of hope he may have had." Beside him, Denise was in complete agreement as she said, "That kid is a strange one, and seems to always exceed everyone's expectations." Her bright eyes looked towards Ummer as she smiled. "Unfortunately for him, he is up against senior brother Ummer this time." She approved of Ummer's meticulous way of doing things. After all, if their Blood Slaughterer Peak was unable to deal with Ezra even after sending out this many disciples, it would be a tremendous blow to their reputation. Ummer chuckled. His eyes narrowed slightly as he looked in the direction Ezra had disappeared in, and waved his hand. A playful smile emerged on his face. "Prepare to pull in the net. It's time to let Ezra experience the methods of our peak." As time passed, the fights that broke out in this massive mountain range grew increasingly intense, while the remaining disciples grew stronger and stronger. Meanwhile, the remaining participants gradually moved towards the depths of the mountain range. At a certain location in the mountain range, 3 disciples from the same peak were currently traveling together. They huddled close, vigilantly scanning their surroundings as they walked. Spiritual energy surged around their bodies, ready to deal with any unforeseen occurrences. Swoosh! The trio immediately turned their heads to the right, only to see a wispy smoke-like figure zip past at a speed too quick for them to get a proper look. Instead, they were only able to detect the trees shaking faintly in its wake. "Who?" they shouted as the spiritual energy around their bodies whizzed even faster in preparation to strike. However, before they could send out a blast of spiritual energy, the wisp-like figure had already vanished from sight. N0VLBN. The trio was dumbstruck as they turned to look at each other. Cold sweat appeared on their foreheads as they said, "Who was that? That was way too fast. Just like a lightning." They didn't even manage to catch a glimpse of his appearance before he vanished. "Never mind, it doesn't matter who it was. Someone so fast should be no pushover," one of them said. The other 2 nodded in agreement. Lightsful, just as they were about to change course, they suddenly felt powerful spiritual energy ripples rapidly closing in on them from all directions, causing their expressions to change drastically. The trio hastily huddled together back to back, spiritual energy surging as they vigilantly swept their gazes in the directions of the spiritual energy ripples. Several dozen breaths later, the trees shook as 7 or 8 glowing figures shot out. They stood atop the surrounding trees, menacingly staring at the huddled trio. "They're from Blood Slaughterer Peak." The eyes of the trio widened when they saw the appearance of the glowing figures. The Blood Slaughterer Peak disciples glanced at the 3 disciples and shouted, "Blood Slaughterer Peak is hunting Ezra Zephyr, and we hope that everyone else will not interfere." After leaving these words, they ignored the trio and shot forth once again. The trio was stunned by the Blood Slaughterer Peak disciples' departure. Soon after, they could not help but mutter, "Despicable Blood Slaughterer Peak, going all out to hunt down Zhou Yuan. That's overkill, right?" One of the disciples frowned, before he said with disdain, "They really lack the trait of honor." Ezra Zephyr is only one of the newer disciples, and one with the brightest future. "I can't believe they're ganging up on him." The other two nodded, and said with some sympathy, "That figure we saw previously should be Ezra Zephyr. He's unlucky to have the entire swarm of Blood Slaughterer disciples after him. I'm afraid that he won't be able to escape this time around." The Blood Slaughterer Peak disciples have made it clear that they will not allow him to become a Diamond Belt disciple. But, hey! Ezra is not alone. "You're right, the Bloodfang army leads are here too. Junior brother Argus Waska would go rampage if they touch his liege." The trio were disciples of Divine Demon Peak. News of this hunt quickly caused a huge commotion in the depths of the mountain range. Numerous disciples sighed at Blood Slaughterer Peak's shamelessness and how unfortunate Ezra Zephyr was. However, even though they sympathized with Ezra Zephyr, practically no one was planning to assist him. After all, in their opinion, Ezra's foundations were weak, and Alchemic Rune Peak was in a pitiful state. Therefore, it didn't seem worthwhile to assist him and incur the wrath of the rising Blood Slaughterer Peak. Nove, LB1N. This situation naturally also caused quite an uproar outside the mountain range, with numerous disciples showing their disapproval. After all, it was unbecoming of Blood Slaughterer Peak to gang up on the rising star, one who could revive the dead Alchemic Rune Peak. However, their criticisms would not change anything, because there was no such thing as absolute fairness in the world, and this place was Spirit-Devouring Mountain, worst of all. Ezra's reputation had grown too quickly, and it was unavoidable for him to eventually suffer some backlash. The most outraged amongst them were naturally Bloodfang members and Elder Lo's disciples. Blood Slaughterer Peak's actions were clearly displaying their complete disregard for Elder Lo's faction. Hence they could so blatantly go about this operation without any fear of retaliation. Elder Lo's expression darkened slightly, as anger flashed across his eyes. However, he ultimately suppressed his rage with a deep breath. The Diamond Belt selection was a cruel test, and there were barely any rules. Therefore, he did not really have any grounds to lodge a complaint to the Peak Master. As such, the prince could only rely on himself. Elder Song and his disciples were outraged as well. After all, they were fellow disciples from Alchemic Rune Peak, making Blood Slaughterer Peak's actions also a display of disrespect towards them. In the face of this scene, even Eily, who always seemed to have some misgivings about Ezra, frowned deeply as she gritted her teeth and said, "I wish I could throw these rascals into the pit of hell." However, there was nothing else she could do besides swearing out loud. Even if they had more participants from their peak to assist Ezra, they would only be akin to a mantis before a cart. The other disciples around her fell silent. Eily stared at that fleeing young figure as she gritted her teeth and said, "Ezra, if you manage to surprise me again today, then I will acknowledge that in the future you have the qualifications to surpass senior brother Sith Wiggins." The disciples around her stared at her in shock. This was the first time a die-hard fan of senior brother Sith Wiggins like herself had spoken such words. Eily menacingly glared back at them. "What are you guys looking at? Do you really believe that he can do it?" All of them shut their mouths, speechless as they shook their heads. Against the most elite Gold Belt disciples from Blood Slaughterer Peak, how could he possibly turn the tables by himself? In contrast to the anger from Elder Lo and Elder Song's disciples, the disciples who came from Blood Slaughterer Peak were rejoicing at Ezra's misfortune. They weren't originally from Alchemic Rune Peak, and did not consider themselves as the disciples of this dying peak. As such, they only felt delight when Ezra was being hunted by Blood Slaughterer Peak. Wasn't he being arrogant previously? But now, it seems like all he can do is flee like a dog that has lost its home. As the crowd watched, the pursuing figures chased deep into the mountain range. In the end, the faint silhouettes of 10 misty mountain peaks began to appear. It seemed like they were beginning to approach the end. Meanwhile, the prince darted into a valley. Dense mist churned in the valley, obscuring his figure. Behind him, the sound of rushing wind was heard as glowing figure after figure descended from the sky, blockading the entire valley. Umar and Denise's figures also descended, landing on a giant tree. They stared at the valley before them and exchanged a look as mocking smiles appeared on their faces. After such a long chase, the panicked wild beast had finally run out of stamina. Quite several disciples soon appeared in the vicinity of the valley. The commotion caused by the blood slaughterer peak disciples was far too large and had naturally drawn over the disciples from the other peaks. Umar's gaze swept about the area as he cupped his fists together with a faint smile. This is between Ezra Zephyr and my peak. If we have disturbed anyone, allow me to apologize. He was subtly warning them not to get involved. The eyes of the disciples that had rushed over flickered faintly in thought. However, they ultimately did not say anything in response. They were after all not close to Ezra Zephyr and naturally did not want to offend Umar and his crew. However, not everyone was of the same opinion. Umar, isn't your peak being too shameless? If you still have a backbone, go and fight Ezra one-on-one. At least you'll have a respectful victory if you win. Why resort to such measures? A clear voice sounded as an alluring beauty walked out and coldly snorted. It was Elna Bink of Arcane Wizardry Peak. After all, she had close ties to Ravina and Mahi. The trio were from the Ryan continent and they had even specifically asked her to aid Ezra Zephyr. Therefore, when she saw the prince being chased, she naturally had to stand up for him. Umar frowned slightly when he saw Elna step forward. However, even before Umar could reply, another voice interjected, Elna, you're Isolde. Elna's brows tightly knitted together as she icily said, and what does this have to do with you? Isolde was expressionless, not giving her an answer. However, his stance was already clear. If Elna intervened, he would step forward to stop her. Elna suddenly realized and angrily clenched her fists. You are aiding them because Ezra killed someone from the Shurian continent in the peak ceremony, right? Isolde didn't deny it and nodded his head. What an imbecile, all these years, and you haven't considered this continent as your home. Isolde was quiet, but a person beside him opened his mouth. That new guy, what was his name? Ezra Zephyr. He doesn't deserve to be in the limelight. We are of noble birth and came from a noble continent to rule the lowly Naren continent and make it habitable. Ezra is a classless moron and bastard son of a useless king. They will sue SSHIINNN. Before that man could speak any further, a Labrys kissed his neck. As a result, the head of that fellow flew into the sky, leaving a fountain of blood behind. Thud. The head of that disciple fell, and the next moment, someone stomped it into minced meat. The eyes of the disciples, including Isolde, widened at the scene, too shocked to move. They looked at the headless body before the light teleported it away. We have the strength to kill you all, but you are in luck. Our prince has prohibited us. And as his loyal subordinates, we shall abide by his wishes. Who else it could be other than Shapeshifter of Bloodfang Kingdom? If it's not for his majesty, you would have been killed by Zulfi Dimitri long ago. Umar flinched. He knew who Zulfi was, Blood Slaughterer Peak's younger generation star. Shifa looked at Elna and said, Senior sister, thank you for your concern, but let them go. Our prince will handle them by himself. Elna understood and nodded his head. Shifa looked at Isolde before turning to go. Wait. You beast girl, do you know that you have killed a disciple of your own peak? Isolde said with visible anger on his face. Shifa nodded her head. Yes, did I break any rule? There are only 10 seats, so fighting with fellow peak members is inevitable. You will go for the top 10 seats? Is that what you mean? Yes. We don't need to fight, senior brother. It's meaningless now. I killed the man who spouted blasphemous words against our prince. So, I don't have much else to do here. If you want to avenge him, do it on a bigger stage, one of the top 10 peaks. Shifa said and then walked away. The disciples looked at her until her figure vanished. Isolde recomposed himself. He and Elna glared at each other for one last time before they both turned and disappeared as well. The only remaining disciples belonged to Blood Slaughterer Peak. Umar withdrew his gaze. He stared at the now locked-down valley, his eyes narrowing slightly as his indifferent voice sounded. Go. At the sound of his voice, the surrounding Blood Slaughterer Peak disciples immediately charged into the valley. Atop the tree, the corners of Denise's lips raised slightly as she watched this scene. Swoosh swish. The instant Umar's voice sounded, 9 Blood Slaughterer Peak disciples split off from the group surrounding the valley and dashed into its fog-filled depths. That valley was quite large, and its topography was rather complex. However, this was not a problem for the 9 individuals, who quickly arranged themselves in a fan formation and began sweeping the area inch by inch. Umar stood atop a tree, his arms crossed across his chest as he instructed, "The rest should prepare yourselves. We'll move the moment we pinpoint Ezra's location." There were nearly 10 figures stationed outside the valley, their sharp gazes continuously scanning the interior of that misty valley. Elna could only release a soft sigh as she watched from afar. There were other arcane wizardry peak disciples beside her, but they had no ties to Ezra Zephyr except one, XYR. They were quite willing to aid Ezra Zephyr. In Inner Mountain, arcane wizardry peak is the strongest. However, in Outer Mountains, the strongest peak was Blood Slaughterer Peak, securing 1st and 3rd rank, while arcane wizardry peak disciple was 2nd strongest. So they wanted a chance to beat Blood Slaughterer Peak, because they were sure to win this time. They had 2 monsters with them, Elna Bink and XYR. But to their bad luck, XYR himself stopped them from interfering. He said their involvement will tuin his master's fun.n, ov-l/b-1/n. The chase of Ezra made Elna rather puzzled. She pondered why the Blood Slaughterer Peak disciples were so obediently following Umar's instructions. Normally speaking, this would only happen if either the chief disciple or one of the 2 rankers gave the order. However, why would someone of that standing have beef with a gold belt disciple like Ezra Zephyr? Her eyes were furrowed in thought for a long time, but she could ultimately only shake her head in defeat before she looked towards the valley in pity. It seems that she had no way to help this time. Ezra was already in a checkmate in Elna's eyes. After all, there was no way he could defeat all the elite gold belt disciples from Blood Slaughterer Peak by himself. But she was also confused about why he rejected every help. Is he that strong or just a plain fool? Junior sisters, I tried to help, but the person you both like doesn't need my help, I'm sorry. Outside the mountain range, everyone stared at the scene projected by the spiritual energy mirror with gritted teeth and clenched fists. Meanwhile, the commotion was also picked up by practically all of the other watching disciples, causing them to break out into noise. Can't believe that the Blood Slaughterer Peak disciples have trapped Ezra in a valley. Furthermore, they're even being led by Umar. Looks like Blood Slaughterer Peak is going all out this time. Ezra is in trouble. However, it's also quite a testament to his ability to have the entire peak banding together to hunt him down. Even if he fails this diamond belt selection, he will become famous in the spirit-devouring mountain. How could this happen? I placed a huge bet on him. Hey, don't worry, you saw how junior sister Shafa killed that disciple, even senior brother Isolde couldn't react. If Ezra has prohibited them from helping him, then he must have had a plan. I think so too, we might see the biggest upset in diamond belt selection. While all kinds of opinions and discussions erupted, practically everyone in the area turned their gazes to this particular spiritual energy mirror. Atop the most majestic peak, the 7 peak masters also noticed the commotion. A quick scan immediately told them what had happened, as astonishment flashed across their eyes. It was extremely rare for all the disciples from a single to band together for the sake of dealing with a single person during a purple sash selection. Haha, Peak Master Terror, it seems like your Blood Slaughterer Peak disciples are quite experienced in overwhelming others with numbers. Colleen Evil Peak's Master Sidra Vermidov's gaze swept around as a sneer arose on her red lips. The handsome Blood Slaughterer Peak's Master, Terror, was dressed in white today. He cast his rippleless deep pool-like eyes towards the depths of the mountain range, as surprise flashed within them. It was evident that he did not expect his disciples to gang up on Ezra Zephyr. However, he was only a little surprised and not angry at all. Nov LB.1n. Peak Master Terror chuckled softly, before he said in an unconcerned manner, Peak Master Sidra, the diamond belt selection does have its rules, and my disciples are not breaking any of them. That disciple called Ezra has been riding high ever since he stepped on the sex land, and others will obviously become displeased. They're youngsters after all. However, after he has gone through this experience, I believe he will likely become a more composed individual in the future. Frankly speaking, this isn't bad news for him. Peak Master Sidra chuckled. He looked towards a bald lanky man wearing blue clothes, as he smiled and said, of course, if my blood slaughterer Peak disciples break the rules, I will punish them personally. The bald man was called Master Liam. He was the head of disciplinary elders, a separate entity under the direct order of the supreme leader. One of his few tasks was to keep everyone in check. Even though he did not know why his disciples were targeting Ezra, it did not matter to him. After all, someone of his stature had no reason to concern himself with Outer Mountains matters. In his opinion, his blood slaughterer Peak disciples were not in the wrong either. Their actions aligned with the motto of their peak to be straightforward and decisive like a weapon. Once you've decided, you should go ahead without any reservations. Master Liam was in charge of the rules and punishments in the spirit-devouring mountain and was a stern and serious individual. Silver colored his eyes as if they contained a world of void within them, a rather frightening sight to behold. He indifferently said, although the blood slaughterer Peak disciples' actions have caused some tongues to wag, they did not break the rules. At this moment, Peak Master Shims chuckled and said, it is merely a dispute between disciples. There is no need for us to be overly concerned with this matter. He paused for a moment, as he looked at Peak Master Terror and said, however, their actions today will easily draw the ire of others. Peak Master Terror should remind his disciples that though it is good to be straightforward and decisive when one acts, the disciples from the other peaks are still your fellow brothers and sisters. Peak Master Antero gently nodded and said, Peak Master is right. I will discipline those rascals after the selection test. However, judging by his expression, it was clear he did not think his disciples were in the wrong and had only said those words because the arcane wizardry Peak's master had spoken. Didn't Ezra kill disciples earlier? If the answer is yes, then why should he restrict the disciples of his peak? Deep within the mountain range, in the outskirts of the valley, Umar was standing atop a tree, his gaze tightly fixed on the valley. As time passed, he suddenly frowned a little. He had realized that the search party had already scanned the entire valley once. However, they had not uncovered any signs of the prince. The blood slaughterer Peak disciples in the valley jumped into the sky and looked towards Ezra Zephyr in confusion. Senior brother Umar, we can't find him. Outside the valley, a wave of noise swept through the area, shock filling the faces of the many disciples from the various peaks. How did Ezra conceal himself so well? A look of confusion flashed across Umar's eyes. Could he have fled? Beside him, Denise's face was not looking too good at this moment. Lution shook his head and said, that's impossible. We have already sealed off this whole area. There is no way he has escaped. And one more thing, his subordinate Shafa Pista said he prohibited everyone from helping him. He wants to make a name for himself by defeating us on his own. Then, Denise hesitated for a moment. Their previous search had obviously failed to deliver any results. He must still be hiding inside, waiting for an opening to strike. Umar decisively declared. He waved his hand and said, you guys follow me in again. I will lead the search. His body moved, taking charge of the 9 disciples as they charged into the mist-filled valley. With Umar now leading them, half an hour of time passed, before he jumped back onto the mountain with an ugly expression. This time an uproar broke out even outside the mountain range, with countless gazes staring at this scene in shock. None of them had expected Umar and his crew to lose track of Ezra Zephyr after trapping him in the valley. Whispers spread, and some individuals even began to gloat. Blood Slaughterer Peak had caused quite a stir by so brazenly hunting Ezra down together, only to end up losing sight of him when he was right under their noses. If they allowed the prince to escape, these ruling gold belt disciples of Blood Slaughterer Peak would not be able to look at their seniors. The commotion grew louder and louder as it spread. Finally, even Peak Masters began to turn their attention over once again. Haha, now this is interesting. Master Antero chuckled. A look of intrigue had surfaced in his deep and wise eyes, a rarely seen expression to the elders of Arcane Wizardry Peak. Ummer's expression darkened in response to the whispers and amused gazes. He hovered above the valley and looked down at the mist below. With a deep breath, he suppressed his churning emotions as his eyes glowed brightly. Senior Brother Ummer, should we spread out and continue the search? Denise could not help but ask. Her expression was also not a pretty sight. Ummer did not answer. Instead, he continued to stare intensely at the valley below. As he stared, another half an incense stick of time passed. Behind him, Denise grew increasingly impatient. However, just as she was about to speak, Ummer's deep voice slowly sounded. I hate to admit, but Junior Brother Ezra is truly amazing. If I am not mistaken, he should have reached the advanced level of the Gossamer Steps? Advanced level of Gossamer Steps? When Ummer's voice sounded, several onlookers immediately gasped in shock as gaze after gaze tinged with astonishment looked towards the misty valley. I see. Some disciples involuntarily exclaimed. It was said that once one reached the advanced level of the Gossamer Step spiritual technique, one would gain the ability to turn fully gossamer, even concealing the ripples from one's own spiritual energy. It was an extraordinary survival skill that could save one's life. However, it was difficult to reach the advanced level. In the current spirit-devouring mountain, only a handful of Inner Mountain's disciples have managed to achieve this feat. If what Ummer said is true, then Ezra would be the first ever Outer Mountains disciple to master this technique, another gigantic achievement in the list. Besides Ummer, Denise was also taken aback. She soon gritted her teeth and said, that rascal is truly as slippery as a fish. To think that he can still put up such a fight even after being trapped. She had initially believed that it would be the end of the road for Ezra after trapping him here. However, who could have imagined that he would take advantage of the terrain to conceal himself, resulting in them being unable to find him? She looked towards Ummer and asked, Senior Brother Ummer, what should we do now? So many gold belt disciples from Blood Slaughterer Peak have been deployed for this operation today. If the werewolf prince was allowed to slip away right under their noses, their peak would become the target of mocking. Ummer gazed at the mist-filled valley below with slightly narrowed eyes. With a soft laugh, he said, even though Junior Brother Ezra has surprised me somewhat, it will be a little too naive for him to believe he will dominate us with just the Gossamer Steps. His gaze swept about the area, looking towards the Blood Slaughterer Peak disciples as he said, fellow brother disciples, use your spiritual energy to seal the valley. He will use guerrilla tactic, he will use his speed to hit us one by one, make pairs, and quickly seal it. Understood. The Blood Slaughterer Peak disciples immediately responded to Ummer's words. In the next instant, streams of powerful spiritual energy rose from within their bodies like smoke, and quickly spread out to envelope the entire valley. It was a boundary, only used by Blood Slaughterer Peak. The spiritual energy was akin to a giant net, covering the entire valley. BBZZZZ. After covering the valley, they began to shake as beams of spiritual energy light shot forth, dashing into the valley like swimming fish. As the fish swam past, the thick fog was torn apart, and gradually began to dissipate. These spiritual fish were linked to each other and could penetrate every nook and cranny, allowing them to tear through even the ungraspable mist. Evidently, this was a unique search method from Blood Slaughterer Peak.N/O/V-E-L-B-/I-N. Ummer stood in the sky, his sharp gaze fixed on the valley below, as his senses observed every tiny vibration. Under his careful watch, the spiritual energy fish continued their advance. As the spiritual energy continued to slice through the fog, the mist in the valley grew lighter and lighter. In the end, all the mist was pushed back towards the deepest part of the valley, ultimately gathering in a small area, which was less than a few feet wide. At this juncture, the powerful energy from the blood slaughterer peak finally stopped, as if they had run into an obstacle. On the tree, a small smile appeared from the corners of Ummer's lips when he saw this. He waved his sleeve, sending out a gale of spiritual energy. It immediately blew away the final patch of mist, and a boulder promptly appeared. The air above the boulder rippled faintly. In the end, a figure gradually materialized, appearing before the eyes of the crowd. That familiar figure belonged to the Prince of Bloodfang Kingdom, Ezra Zephyr. Uproar. Regretful sounds were immediately heard outside the valley. The prince had still been found in the end. What a pity. If only he could continue to hide from them, Blood Slaughterer Peak would be the ones making a fool of themselves today. A disciple sighed. The fact that he was able to conceal himself from them for so long already demonstrates that he is highly skilled. After all, this valley isn't that big. Ummer and others are after all the top gold belt disciples of Blood Slaughterer Peak. Ezra is still a little inexperienced in comparison. Outside the valley, Ummer smiled slightly when he saw Ezra's figure appear. With a wave of his hand, the numerous disciples surrounded the prince and began to approach. Finally, he stepped into the valley and walked towards the werewolf. Junior brother Ezra has some good techniques. You nearly managed to hide from us. Ummer stood in front of Ezra as he spoke with a smile. Behind him, Denise was also looking at Ezra with a sneer on her face and joy filling her eyes. He had finally fallen into her hands. Seated atop the boulder, Ezra gazed at the 20 or so Blood Slaughterer Peak disciples surrounding him, as his gaze lowered slightly. Your peak must think quite highly of me to have sent so many of you. Oh Lord! I am scared, what should I do? The entire sect will condemn you for overwhelming a rising star. Ummer sighed helplessly and said, I was initially of the same opinion. However, after witnessing junior brother Ezra's methods, I am glad that I brought along such a huge crew. If not, I may not have even found you today. If he was alone, there was no way he would be able to scour every inch of the valley and force Ezra out. With the perfect gossamer steps, even if Ezra could not defeat Ummer, the former would still easily be able to escape from the latter's hands. Ummer gazed at the prince and chuckled. Thankfully, Lady Luck chose to side with me in the end. After creating so many waves in the spirit-devouring mountain, I believe that you must have had your fill. Therefore, it will be best for you to lay low from now onwards. Haha, like hell I would. Ezra retorted. Junior brother, on account of the fact that you forced me to rack my brains to force you out, how about you voluntarily quit this diamond belt selection and save us the trouble? It will save you a crippling injury as well. He looked at Ezra Zephyr with a superficial smile. What if I don't want to? Ezra answered with a smirk. Ummer shrugged. He did not say anything else and instead waved his hand. The surrounding disciples immediately locked onto the prince, as their formidable sharp spiritual energy began to surge. The prince did not pay attention to these Blood Slaughterer Peak disciples. Instead, he lifted his head and looked at Ezra, as a mysterious smile flowed out from the corners of his mouth. Ummer it is, right? You seem to be under the impression that I have been using my gossamer steps to hide from you. Ummer's eyes narrowed slightly. What else could it be? The gossamer steps is indeed a wonderful technique. However, it is quite useless in a situation like this. Ezra smirked, his smile tinged with a hint of mockery. I never ran from you, I just wanted all you shitbags to find me here, together. I wanted to give you a big surprise on a fated land. Ezra paused for a second and continued as he hit the ground with his heel. That fated land is right here. Ummer's eyes widened slightly as he stared deeply at Ezra Zephyr. However, he did not panic because of the latter's words, but instead calmly waved his hand. Junior brother, if this is your final attempt to resist, it is a truly childish one. It was obvious that he did not believe what Ezra had said. From what he could see, the prince was merely bluffing in hopes of causing them to make a mistake so that the latter may find an opening to run away. Therefore, he gave the order for them to attack without any hesitation at all. Swoosh! The blood slaughterer peak dashed forward the moment they heard his order. Spiritual energy pulsed from their armaments as they thrust towards the prince. The prince watched the formidable attacks approach as his gaze lowered slightly. Following which, a ripple suddenly erupted from his fingers. Bzzz. Bzzz. The spiritual energy ripple swept outwards. At that very moment, several light beams began shooting out from the valley, interweaving together. In the blink of an eye, they transformed into a boundary that completely enveloped the entire valley. This sudden turn of events caused the numerous disciples outside the valley to be completely shocked. The corners of Ezra's mouth raised slightly as his hands joined together. 4th grade rune boundary, punishing prison of blaze and bolt. When the boundary wrapped around the entire valley, everyone saw crimson clouds appear in the sky above, as scorching waves of spiritual energy rapidly converged. Under the searing heat, the creek flowing in the valley instantly evaporated. This sudden turn of events shocked everyone present. All of the disciples were stupefied as they blankly stared at the boundary that had risen from the valley, and the red thundering clouds in the sky above. The violent undulations radiating from the clouds were so powerful that even core foundation experts would feel extremely threatened. A boundary? Elma Bink's pretty face was filled with astonishment as she gazed upon this scene. What kind of boundary is it? I have never heard of it. A soft voice released by a male. She turned her head to look, only to discover that it was Kursi, a former disciple of Alchemic Rune Peak, who came to Arcane Wizardry Peak along with Govern. As she looked at the boundary, a look of admiration appeared on her face. Junior brother Ezra is truly amazing. No matter how you look at it, this boundary is the powerhouse compared to our grade 4 boundaries, a boundary such as that is extremely difficult to set up. This doesn't belong to Alchemic Rune Peak, I don't know how he got his hands on such a boundary. N.OVELBN. With this boundary in place, it doesn't matter how many disciples Blood Slaughterer Peak sends, there is no longer anything they can do to junior brother Ezra. Said Kursi. Elna's eyes widened before she took in a deep breath. Ezra Zephyr was indeed extremely surprising. To think that he would be able to carve out a path for himself even in such a dire situation. If Ezra Zephyr managed to escape from Blood Slaughterer Peak's encirclement today, they would truly lose all face. When she thought of this, even Elna felt a little joy at their misfortune. While the disciples outside the valley were gasping in shock, the commotion outside the mountain range was even more unimaginable. Countless disciples burst out into gasps of astonishment, creating a tsunami of noise that flooded the area. Just moments ago, everyone was under the impression that the prince had been forced into a dead end by Blood Slaughterer Peak. Besides voluntarily withdrawing from the Diamond Belt selection to keep his dignity, there seemed to be no other route he could take. However, none of them had expected that he would suddenly blow away their trump card in the blink of an eye. Unbeknownst to everyone, he had already set up an extremely formidable 4th grade rune boundary in the valley. A gorgeous smile blossomed on Ella's beautiful face, as her tightly clenched hands slowly loosened. She knew that Ezra would not give up so easily. If they want to force him to his knees, even the elite gold belt disciples from Blood Slaughterer Peak would have to pay a heavy price. Beside Ella, Lycris's expression had turned rather stiff. He too never expected Ezra to have such a trump card hidden up his sleeve. Umar and his crew are trash. I can't believe they allowed a new disciple to set up a boundary right under their noses. Lycris cursed inside. Even though a rune boundary was extremely powerful, it was quite difficult and time-consuming to set it up. And yet, Ezra had managed to deploy it right under Umar and his crew's noses. One had no choice but to admit that Umar and the gang were truly a bunch of dumb asses. They had now lost the initiative, allowing the prince to gradually tip the odds in his favor. To think he still had such rune boundary in his arsenal. Elder Song slowly withdrew his bewildered gaze and turned towards Elder Low, who was as surprised as him from start to end. He gently touched his beard and said, "It seems that you are starting to take interest in Ezra." Elder Song calmed himself and sighed as he said, so he wasn't using the gossamer steps to hide. Instead, his goal was to use to conceal himself in gossamer form so that he could secretly set up the boundary. At the same time, he was also baiting and the rest into the valley. Now that all the prey has entered the net, it's time for him to pull it up. Brilliant! Elder Song stared at the blood slaughterer peak disciples in the mirror, before he said without any sympathy, those guys thought that they were the ones chasing Ezra, but they would never have imagined that he had been using himself as bait from the start. Elder Song stared at the young figure in the spiritual energy mirror, as amazement flitted across her clear eyes. The current Ezra Zephyr was this much powerful, what kind of martial master he would be in upcoming years. Elder Low, I know it will be shameful for me to say this, but, can you share Ezra's talent with our imprint faction? Elder Low smiled but didn't reply. Boom boom. Red thunder clouds churned above the valley, as scorching ripples violently pulsed. The blood slaughterer peak disciples, who were about to attack the prince, had stopped in a panic, a trace of fear in their faces as they gazed at the boundary before them. They could detect an extremely dangerous scent from the boundary. How could they have expected that what they originally believed would be a piece of cake would suddenly take such a turn? As they looked towards Ezra, the contempt in their gazes turned to graveness. Stared at this boundary as his face gently twitched. His gaze swept about the area, finding several glowing rune strips hidden between the cracks of the rocks around the valley. It was these rune strips that formed the boundary. However, he had not noticed them previously, and did not know when Ezra Zephyr placed them down. Stared intently at Ezra and said, "You were using gossamer steps to secretly set up the boundary." The prince smiled but did not answer. It was already obvious after all. Smiled bitterly. Previously, he had thought that Ezra was merely hiding from them. Who could have imagined that the latter never had any intention of hiding? Rather, he was completing a boundary right under their noses. Behind there was a dazed look on Denise Tubble as she blankly stared at this scene. The joy in her eyes had already completely vanished, fear now in its place. "Senior brother, she mumbled with a trembling voice. Took in a deep breath, as he gradually regained his calm. "There is no need to panic, we will deal with him together. Though this boundary is extremely powerful, I don't believe that it is capable of wiping out our entire party. Nov.lb, 1n. This is his final trump card. Once we cross it, I will make him pay a painful price." Thanks to Umr's words, the panicking blood slaughterer peak disciples finally regained their balance. They quickly huddled towards as streams of powerful spiritual energy shot into the air, forming protective spiritual energy layers above them. Stared at Ezra like a hawk. Having the tables turned on him had obviously dealt a blow to his ego. However, he knew that there would be a chance to regain his pride as long as they managed to withstand the boundary's assault. Ezra stared at the blood slaughterer peak disciples who had banded together before he chuckled. "Come on, you lots are already shitting your pants when the party has yet to start." Boom. The instant his voice sounded, the spiritual energy accumulating in the rumbling thunderclouds above finally reached the limit. In the next instant, giant red thunderbolts pulsing with the scent of destruction rained down upon the land. Crimson thunderclouds churned above the valley. In the next instant, red thunderbolts filled with the scent of destruction held forth, raining down on the blood slaughterer peak disciples below. Moreover, the fire seemed to burn around the thunderbolts. In the face of the boundary's power, even Umr's expression had become solemn, his eyes filled with caution. Several powerful and thick streams of spiritual energy shot out from Denise, and the rest, forming layers of protective spiritual energy barriers. Evidently, they planned on working together in order to withstand the attacks from the boundary. Boom. The bombardment of burning thunderbolts began, blowing apart the spiritual energy shields one layer after another like a hot knife through butter. As each layer was shattered, and his crew desperately squeezed out all their energy to continuously repair the shields in order to maintain their defenses. Boom boom. As and gang defended, crimson bolts continued to fall from the crimson clouds above. The entire valley was devastated by the resulting shockwaves. The ground was rapidly torn apart, as numerous boulders evaporated into dust. The prince sat on a boulder with a look of indifference on his face, his bracelet glowed and a tea kettle and a cup came out. "The view is too great to not have a tea," the prince loudly said as he poured the tea into the cup. He took a sip and shut his eyes, while the spiritual energy around his head continuously flickered. Controlling a boundary of this level took an extremely heavy toll on his soul. That tea was made from special ingredients, which temporarily boosted his senses. Outside the valley, countless gazes unblinkingly watched the astonishing clash. As they watched, complicated feelings rose within their hearts. Who could have imagined that the top elite gold belt disciples of Blood Slaughterer Peak would wind up in such a sorry state, single-handedly trapped by Ezra in this valley, and assaulted by a heavy barrage of attacks? They turned to look at that young figure atop the boulder, their eyes were filled with caution and respect. Before today, many of them had regarded Ezra as a new disciple who had just entered the outer mountains. Even though he had some accomplishments under his belt, most believed that he was still lacking compared to the veteran disciples, and they did not consider him as a serious threat. In fact, after his performance at Alchemic Rune Peak, many people started to degrade his reputation out of nothing but hatred, which inevitability downplayed his accomplishments. However, Ezra was currently facing the most outstanding gold belt disciples of Blood Slaughterer Peak all by himself, a feat that finally made everyone feel slightly in awe of him. This new outer mountain disciple had already become powerful, that he now possessed the qualifications to challenge and even surpass the senior disciples. Boom boom. The crimson clouds churned violently as they absorbed spiritual energy from their surroundings, transforming it into an endless shower of crimson lightning. Inside the valley, Umar and gang bitterly hung on inside the layers of shields. However, it was clear that the scales were slowly but surely tipping against them. No/LB1N. Since the boundary is able to absorb the surrounding spiritual energy, the ones who run out of stamina first will be us, said Umar in a heavy voice. The smile on his face had vanished long ago. The other disciples asked in a panic, "What should we do?" Umar stared at the crimson clouds in the sky as he said, "It is meaningless for us to focus on defense. We must go on the offense instead. Only by destroying the clouds will the boundary naturally crumble. We must prepare our strongest attack and destroy the clouds. But once we disperse our defenses, how will we protect ourselves against the crimson bolts?" Beside him, Denise gritted her teeth as she retrieved a long white glowing glass ball. The glowing ball was covered in ancient runes and looked as if an entire sea had been poured into it. "Senior brother Umar, this holy water pearl armament of mine specializes in defense, and should be able to buy us some time." Umar's eyes lit up when he saw this. The holy water pearl was a defensive spiritual treasure and could be found in the Glittering Jewels Pavilion. However, it was not cheap, and cost at least 3,000 pieces of spirit jades. Nonetheless, most Diamond Belt disciples will try their best to purchase one before going out on missions. He never expected Denise to possess one as well. Being an offspring of a rich family has its own perks. "Then we'll have to trouble junior sister." Denise shook her head as she stared at Ezra and said, "It's no trouble at all. I do not want to become his stepping stone and help grow his fame." Initially, she thought that she could finally kill Ezra to avenge his brother and relieve the pent-up resentment in her heart. However, the situation was now completely out of her expectations. In fact, a single slip was all it would take for them to end up dying and boosting Ezra's fame via their Blood Slaughterer Peak's reputation. This would be an extremely painful and humiliating death for them. If they somehow managed to live, none of them would be able to escape punishment. Angst rose within Denise's heart the moment she recalled their Peak Master's character. She knew that the stakes were already too high, and there was no way they could allow themselves to be defeated by Ezra. With these thoughts in mind, Denise gently flicked her wrist. The holy water pearl promptly transformed into a glowing dot as it rose into the sky. In an instant, a screen of sea-like water spread, wrapping around them like a capsule. Glowing runes appeared on the water, pulsing with powerful spiritual energy. Boom boom. Thunderbolts bombarded the water shield, stirring violent ripples on it. However, the attacks were ultimately neutralized by the water shield. As more and more crimson bolts rained down, the water shield began to grow thinner and thinner. As more and more crimson bolts rained down, the water shield began to grow thinner and thinner. Denise urgently said, "Senior brother I am afraid that the holy water pearl won't last much longer." Solemnly nodded. He icily stared at Ezra and said, "Let's join forces and transform our energy into swords. We must shatter the crimson clouds." Bang. As the voice rang out, a torrent of powerful spiritual energy shot into the sky. The Blood Slaughterer Peak disciples around him also began to circulate their spiritual energy. Stream after stream of energy gathered together, transforming into a several hundred feet tall spiritual energy pillar in the air. The spiritual energy rose straight into the sky like smoke. A sharp and deadly aura pulsed from it, causing the surrounding space to distort. Clapped his hands together. He was the person in charge, and the thick spiritual energy column in the sky was thus under his control. The pressure of wielding such tremendous power caused the veins to pop out on his forehead, and even his eyes began to turn blood red. He gritted his teeth and began directing the energy. Under the shocked eyes of the crowd, the giant spiritual energy pillar began to shrink, before it finally transformed into a several hundred feet large glowing sword. That glowing sword towered between the land and the sky, pulsing with an unrivaled aura of sharpness. "Hey, look at he is able to gather the spiritual energy from the other disciples and transform it into a sword." Several disciples sighed in admiration. The spiritual energy that they practice seems to be of the same source. Looks like Blood Slaughterer Peak does have its unique methods. If can destroy the crimson clouds, Ezra Zephyr's boundary will fall apart. Does indeed live up to his title as the #1 gold belt disciple of Blood Slaughterer Peak. Amazingly, he found a way out even in such a desperate situation. Atop the boulder, the prince naturally realized what and the rest were doing. His spiritual energy shuddered, and the red clouds in the sky began to shrink into the shape of a funnel, as alarming spiritual energy undulations began to converge. Manipulating the boundary on such a grand scale was naturally extremely taxing on Ezra Zephyr's body. In fact, a grade 4 boundary is the peak limit of a core formation stage expert. However, despite the pain, he showed no signs of stopping. At this juncture, all he could do was advance. Otherwise, he won't be able to show the sect what he wanted to. Therefore, the prince remained calm, while the shuddering of his energy grew increasingly violent. Under the nervous stares of the crowd, both parties prepared their strongest attack in hopes of utterly blowing away the other. The veins on face squirmed violently, making him appear rather hideous. He looked at the giant glowing sword, feeling the powerful sharp energy within before his eyes locked onto Ezra Zephyr. "If you want my Blood Slaughterer Peak to become your stepping stone, I can only tell you to stop dreaming." In the wake of his yell, the glowing sword suddenly dashed into the sky, leaving behind a tail of flames. Sword spiritual energy howled, charging straight towards the crimson thunderclouds in the sky. Ezra's tightly shut eyes finally opened at this moment, a trail of blood dripping from the corner of his eye. This was the sign that he had pushed his body to its limit. He lifted his head and stared at the crimson funnel-shaped thundercloud. "Crimson! Bolt! Blaze!" A deep voice emerged from his mouth. "Cackle!" A crimson light poured out from the thundercloud, taking the shape of 100 feet wide flaming crimson rod. Lightning swam and swirled around the flaming rod, as extremely berserk undulations devastated its surroundings. The entire boundary trembled as the crimson rod of fire shot out. This was because it had exhausted all its spiritual energy. SWIISSSH. Under the attention of numerous nervous observers, the glowing sword dashed upwards, while the crimson flaming rod fell. In the end, they viciously crashed into each other. Boom! An earth-shattering explosion unfurled above the valley. El Nabisque, Isolde Loxend and the other watching disciples quickly retreated to avoid being caught in the aftershocks. Outside the mountain range, numerous gazes were glued to the epicenter of the clash. The violent shockwaves continued to wreak havoc for quite some time, before slowly dying down as the dust also began to settle. The valley had been completely destroyed, basically turning into a flat land. The debris scattered all over the ground indicated just how much destruction the shockwaves had caused. No/V.E/L/B/1N. Who won? Many disciples hurriedly cast their gazes over. On the flattened valley, Denise Tubble and the rest of their crew had not moved from the spot, their bodies as still as statues. Opposite them, the boulder on which Ezra had sat had already been turned to dust, leaving him now standing instead of his original spot. Fresh blood flowed down from the corner of his eye, making him appear rather sinister. The entire valley was deathly silent. A cool breeze blew past. Huuuuu. Next, countless gazes watched in shock as the dust completely settled. What they saw were burnt bodies of Blood Slaughterer Peak disciples. Under the setting sun, the crisped bodies began to fall backwards onto the ground one after another. It was an extremely shocking sight. It was completely silent both outside the valley and the mountain range. Hoo! Another gentle breeze blew past in the leveled valley, sweeping up a cloud of dust. Regardless of whether it was outside the valley or the mountain range, everyone's gazes seemed to have frozen as they stared at the figures in the valley. At this time, a bloody fog was still drifting in the air, while the Peak disciples fell on their backs, one after another. Beams of light descended from the sky, sweeping up the dead disciples, and tossing them out of the mountain range. Only then did the countless stunned gazes gradually begin to return to their senses. By this time, most of the Blood Slaughterer Peak disciples were already gone from the devastated valley, and only two figures remained. The one standing at the front was His hair was scattered behind him, and his complexion was deathly pale, making him cut an extremely sorry figure. But he was unharmed. Behind him was a completely unscathed Denise Tubble. Her main task had been to control the holy water pearl earlier and had thus not poured any spiritual energy into the glowing sword. As a result, she had not been caught up in the earlier clash. However, even though she looked completely unhurt, her eyes were filled with terror. She trembled as she stared at her front, where the boulder Ezra sat on previously had already turned into dust, leaving him silently standing there. Ezra's sleeves had been blasted apart at some unknown time. He wore an expression of cold indifference, while blood flowed from the corners of his eyes, making him look rather terrifying. "You damn mutt, I could have killed them simply with my sword. Why did you put me up with this shitty boundary?" Ezra said in his mind. "Ha ha ha." A hoarse laughter came. "You must get experience in battle beforehand, boy. You are in a miserable state because you have no experience in handling a boundary. You spent 4 times the required amount of spiritual energy. Haha, take it as a lesson." The monstrous wolf of Norse cackled. Ezra Zephyr paid no heed to the blood, as he stared at the pale Under his stare, Ummer's chest rose faintly. Just as he was about to speak, he suddenly vomited out a mouthful of fresh blood, before a bitter smile appeared on his face. "Ezra, you indeed are a startling prodigy. Reports didn't do justice to your power." His voice was hoarse. Ummer never imagined that this would be the final outcome of their hunt. Nearly 20 of the most elite gold belt disciples from Blood Slaughterer Peak had joined forces, and yet, they had not only failed to easily finish off Ezra but instead allowed him to successfully set up a boundary, turn the tables on them and wipe out their entire team. Concerning such an outcome, even Ummer had no choice but to smile bitterly. However, he was not upset about it at all. After all, he had already gone all out against the prince. That was the reason why he had chosen to ignore his image and sent so many gold belt disciples after the latter. He had already tried his best but had still lost in the end. This wasn't because he underestimated Ezra. Rather, the werewolf prince simply had too many cards hidden up his sleeves. "In the future, you might become one of the top figures in our spirit-devouring mountain. Ezra Zephyr. I wish I could become your subordinate." "I have heard you treasure your subordinates, is that true?" The prince kept his serious expression and nodded. until they are usable. Let out a hoarse chuckle, before slowly shutting his eyes as his body began to fall. He had also exhausted all his spiritual energy in the previous clash and unintentionally harmed his core. My journey of martial prowess ends here. I wish you luck, Ezra Zephyr. Take this. Ezra threw a pill. Was startled. What's that for? Asked. Your core is not hurt, take this pill. I'll give you a chance to join my Bloodfang faction, said the prince. It took 2 minutes to end their chatter. Ate the pill and jumped away, leaving Denise Tubble behind. Say senior brother. Denise tried to follow him but was stopped. You are not allowed to go. The stopper was Ezra. He took his step towards Denise. Denise was trembling. Aye, sir. Before she could surrender, Ezra spoke. I have no intention to kill you, I just need something from you. Denise stopped. She fearfully looked at Ezra and asked. What? What do you need? The prince came close to Denise and uttered. Your head. Swish. In the next moment, a beam of light fell from the sky and swept him away. When Ezra saw that Denise's body and head had disappeared, he finally gingerly raised his hand and wiped off the traces of blood at the corners of his eyes. A sharp pain stabbed him between his brows, making him feel a little dizzy. This was a sign that he had pushed his body and mental power to its limit. Boom. The instant Denise's body was swept out of the selection test, an earth-shattering commotion erupted both inside and outside the mountain range, a wave of noise dashing into the sky. What had they just witnessed? NO/V.EL/B/1N. Ezra had single-handedly eliminated all the top gold belt disciples of Blood Slaughterer Peak. Numerous disciples had their mouths ajar, their faces were filled with shock. The scenario of a single person eliminating all the participants from an entire peak had never happened in the spirit-devouring mountain before. However, they had just witnessed it today. That's crazy, right? Some disciples muttered to themselves, while others felt that they were dreaming. Numerous disciples swallowed, respect appearing in their eyes as they looked at the young figure projected by the spiritual energy mirror. After today's battle, Ezra's reputation would likely exceed even some of the veteran Diamond Belt disciples. As she listened to the commotion that infected the many mountains, Ella's face began to glow. She proudly stuck out her chest as she turned to look at the shell-shocked female disciples around her. The female disciples turned to look at one another, evidently so stunned by Ezra's accomplishment that they were at a loss for words. A pleased grin emerged on Ella's face, before she glanced at Lycris, whose face was now a mix of green and white, and said, Junior brother Lycris, what do you think now? Lycris's expression was rather ugly as he forced a smile and said, haha, his luck is not bad. His boundary was also at its limit earlier, and if had held on for just a little longer, Ezra Zephyr would have been defeated instead. His words drew the disdain of not only Ella Abella but even made some of the female disciples, who were his fans, purse their lips. They clearly felt that Lycris was being too petty, and did not even have the courage to acknowledge the truth. Ezra had taken on all the gold belt disciples from Blood Slaughterer Peak by himself. How gutsy was that? And yet, Lycris refused to give his acknowledgement. Such pettiness was clear for all to see. Under those disdainful gazes, Lycris felt his face burn as he quickly withdrew. However, he was filled with anger when he looked towards the prince's projection in the mirror. You brainless kid. Do you think that it is very glamorous for you to eliminate Denise Tubble and the rest? The two rankers of Blood Slaughterer Peak are known to be overprotective. You may have made a name for yourself today, but you have also offended both of them. Not to mention, the uncle of Denise Tubble is an elder in our sect, you will definitely suffer in the future. The disciples from Elder Lo's faction were already cheering. All of their faces were flushed with excitement and emotion. There was no longer any of the past contempt when the disciples from the other peaks looked over, but instead curiosity in their eyes. Ezra's performance in this Diamond Belt selection test clearly made the other disciples no longer dare to look down on Alchemic Rune Peak like before. Mubarak sighed as he said, Junior brother Ezra is truly amazing. Ezra's victory was certainly a tremendous boost to their reputation. Elderlock stroked his beard, a big smile on his typically stern face. He seemed to feel increasingly gratified as he looked at the prince. Old man Low, it seems like you have picked up a gem this time. Elder Song walked over as he smiled at Elder Low. The envy in his voice was difficult to conceal. Ezra Zephyr had stolen the show today, and since he belonged to Elder Low's faction, it would inevitably also allow Elder Low to gain face. In fact, it had been a long time since such amazing battle accomplishments had come from someone from their alchemic rune peak. Nearby, Eiley and the rest were wide-eyed as they stared at this scene. Eiley involuntarily said, "That man is simply too strange. It's almost like he's an abnormality." One of the disciples around her quietly whispered, "Senior sister, do you think that he has the qualifications to surpass Senior Sith Wiggins now?" Eiley made a pose like she was going to hit him, as she angrily said, "Are you looking for a beating?" She paused for a moment, her lips pulling outwards as she said, "I admit that he's very formidable. As for your question, I don't want to answer it." She stared at that slim figure in the spiritual energy mirror in silence for a moment, before she slowly opened her mouth again. "If we give him some years, I believe he might be able to surpass Senior Sith and become the apex disciple of our spirit-devouring mountain. Perhaps, he may truly be the one that will lead our sect back to glory." A wave of noise surged through the mountains, clearly demonstrating how shocked the many disciples were inside. To be more accurate, it even spread to the highest peak. 7 powerful existences that were renowned across the entire Naren continent turned their attention towards the deepest part of the mountain range. They were naturally aware of the outcome of that fight. For a time, surprise flashed across the faces of Peak Masters. "Haha, this is interesting." Master Antero chuckled, a look of appreciation in his eyes. As the Peak Master of the leading peak, he naturally felt pleased to have such an outstanding disciple in the sect. Colleen Evil Peak Master Bisma also looked in amazement at the figure in the depths of the mountain range. She soon turned to look at Peak Master Terror and said with a skin-deep smile, "Master Terror, Blood Slaughterer Peak has been constantly snatching up all the most talented disciples over the years. But from what I can see, they don't seem to amount to much. I can't believe that the entire team was eliminated by a single alchemy disciple." She did not get along well with Peak Master Terror and was naturally not going to miss out on the chance to rub it on when Blood Slaughterer Peak had suffered such a huge loss. Peak Master Terror nonchalantly smiled as he said, "That disciple named Ezra Zephyr is truly a rarely found good seedling." His gaze swept towards a certain direction, where the elders from Blood Slaughterer Peak were located. When these elders noticed his gaze, all of them lowered their heads in embarrassment. The eliminated disciples belonged to their factions after all. Peak Master Terror suddenly said, "It seems like my gold belt disciples lack training." The group of elders heard his words and felt their hearts shake when they heard his words. Even though they could not detect any hints of anger in Peak Master Terror's voice, his words were evidently voicing his displeasure. Umar and the gang's performance had made Peak Master Terror feel quite humiliated. After today's debacle, punishment was unavoidable. As elders of Blood Slaughterer Peak, they clearly understood Master Terror's character. If Umar and his crew managed to finish off Ezra Zephyr, even if others complained that they were ganging up on him, the Peak Master would ignore them. This was because he only cared about the results and not the process. However, Umar and his crew had lost, causing Blood Slaughterer Peak to lose face in the spirit-devouring mountain. In Master Terror's eyes, these disciples would undoubtedly be regarded as useless. As they thought about the punishment that Umar and the rest would face, the elders could only sigh inside. Umar was actually an extremely talented disciple. Otherwise, there was no way he could become the #1 gold belt disciple of Blood Slaughterer Peak. However, the Peak Master's opinion of him would drop drastically after today. While the entire place was in shock, Ezra gently massaged his throbbing head in the flattened valley. N0VLBN. Blood Slaughterer Peak had lost a great amount of face today, and would likely face some difficulties in the near future. Therefore, they would likely be unable to spare energy to cause trouble for him for the time being. As he lifted his hand, mark after mark began to fly over, landing on the back of his hand. There were a total of 25 marks. These were the marks donated to him by Denise Tubble and other Blood Slaughterer Peak disciples. With these marks, he could finally ascend one of the peaks. At the very least, he was definitely going to become a Diamond Belt disciple. However, the prince was not looking for the least. After collecting the marks, Ezra Zephyr lifted his head and looked at the other disciples around the edges of the valley. They had been observing the fight between him and Blood Slaughterer Peak previously. When the surrounding disciples saw Ezra's look over, their eyes widened slightly as looks of caution and wariness appeared on their faces. They began to slowly back away, showing that they had no intention of fighting with the prince. Evidently, seeing Ezra wipe out the entire Blood Slaughterer Peak team had left a deep impression in their hearts. Only Elna Bink from Arcane Wizardry Peak moved forward and landed at a spot near Ezra Zephyr as she said, "I never expected you to be so powerful. Can't believe you actually managed to eliminate all the Blood Slaughterer Peak disciples." The prince grinned at her. Elna had a beautiful face and Ezra had a good opinion of her. After all, he had seen earlier that she was the only one who had stepped forward to help him, although she was ultimately stopped by a sold lock sent from Zenith Ghost Peak. "The 10 peaks are not far from here. Want to head there together?" asked Elna. The prince fell into thought for a moment, before he nodded with a smirk. He could use this chance to get close to a new beauty. Lust was brewing beneath his fangs. Therefore, the two of them decided to travel together. The other disciples quickly gave way. There was no longer anyone who dared to stand in Ezra's way after witnessing him wipe out the Blood Slaughterer Peak team. Hence, the subsequent traveling was smooth, and without any obstacles. Eventually, Elna and Ezra began to slow down. A giant mountain stood to their front, 10 peaks rising from it like 10 fingers. At the bottom of each peak was a thick and heavy-looking stone door. It was clear that one could ascend the peaks by passing through here. At the same time, one would finally learn what format the championship battle would take. 10 peaks rose from the majestic mountain like 10 fingers. At the foot of each peak stood 10 heavy stone doors that one needed to cross in order to ascend the peaks, blocking the paths of numerous disciples. The prince stood at the foot of the mountain, sighing inside as he gazed at the 10 stone doors. Once he passed through any of these doors, he would finally be promoted to a Diamond Belt disciple, and become a pillar of the spirit-devouring mountain's outer mountains. Of course, what naturally followed was the envious luxurious treatment that every Diamond Belt disciple enjoyed. Only God knew how many disciples worked tirelessly in hopes of receiving it. The prince gazed at the stone doors, but did not immediately make a move. Instead, he quietly stood there as he tried to calm the stabbing pain his head was experiencing. As he waited, the sound of rushing air continuously sounded in the vicinity as figure after figure arrived. There were obviously much fewer people compared to earlier. However, every one of them was surrounded by powerful spiritual energy and had sharp and determined looks in their eyes. It was obvious that none of them were ordinary individuals. After all, they had to defeat numerous opponents in order to reach this place, many of whom were considered elite gold belt disciples of the outer mountains and were definitely not weak. There were currently 5 figures standing at the very front of the group. They were Elna from Arcane Wizardry Peak, Valorly from Colleen Evil Peak, Isolde Laxand from Zenith Ghost Peak, Graham Martinez from Heavenly Fiend Peak and Maximus from Divine Demon Peak. The 5 of them were the number 1 gold belt disciples of their respective peaks, just like Ezra and Umar. None of the other disciples even dared to stand too close to the 5, clearly showing that none of them had any intentions of fighting with these 5. Of course, besides these 5 individuals, there was also no one within a few dozen feet radius of Ezra Zephyr. Even Elna and the 4 other first-seat gold belt disciples looked at Ezra with wariness. Ovelbin. It was obvious that Ezra's feat of wiping out the entire Blood Slaughterer Peak team had simply been too shocking. What's more, Umar had been amongst this group, someone whose strength was equal to their own. Even so, all of them were ultimately kicked out of the selection by Ezra Zephyr. Such battle power was indeed very terrifying. Therefore, no one dared to offend the prince. Though they knew that Ezra had won because of the boundary he had set up, it was still part of his ability. The next moment, many more familiar faces arrived. XYR, there are Gale Arms, Ravina in Gale, Mahi in Gale, Argus Waska, Shapeshifter, and the final one to arrive was Zulfi Dimitri. His armor was soaked in blood. There was another man with Zulfi. The eyes of the disciples widened when they saw him. He was the only survivor of Crimson Clouds and Bolts, the strongest gold belt of Blood Slaughterer Peak, Umr. As more and more disciples gathered at the foot of the 10-peak mountain, Elna, and the rest finally made their move. Everyone watched as they moved forward, each individual arriving in front of one of the stone doors. Following which, standing in front of their respective doors, they swept their gazes around the place. Their intent was clear: these 5 doors were taken. When the prince saw this, he too moved, landing in front of the 6th stone door. Anyone who disagreed could step forward and challenge any of the 6. If the challenger won, he or she would be able to take their spot. However, it was obvious that not many disciples dared to challenge these first-seat gold belt disciples of their respective peaks. If it were the past, the prince would definitely be challenged by numerous disciples if he tried to take over one of the stone doors. In their eyes, the Ezra Zephyr from back then was not qualified to do so. However, after today's battle with the Blood Slaughterer Peak disciples, everyone had already erased such thoughts from their minds. They would rather challenge the other 5. None of them had the courage to face this demon of a disciple who had wiped out the entire team. As such, only 4 stone doors remained. In other words, intense battles would soon occur in front of these last 4 doors. In order to be promoted to a Diamond Belt disciple, every disciple here had raised their battle power to the limit. Therefore, an extremely chaotic battle was sure to erupt in front of these doors. In contrast, the area around the prince and the other 5 would be deserted and peaceful, since no one was going to challenge them. As such, they could only quietly observe the fights taking place in front of the 4 remaining doors. The chaotic and intense battles lasted for nearly an incense stick of time. In the end, 4 disciples prevailed amidst a heap of groaning bodies. Though they were riddled with injuries, they were bursting with excitement as they stood in front of the 4 stone doors, the emotions in their eyes clear for all to see. They were XYR, Zulfi Dimitri, Ravina in Gale, and their Gale Arms. When all 10 disciples stood in front of the stone doors, a series of sighs sounded outside the mountain range. Because this meant that these 10 disciples now possessed the qualifications to become Diamond Belt disciples. The eyes of countless disciples were overflowing with envy as they gazed at the 10 figures. To become a Diamond Belt disciple was the goal of every Outer Mountain disciple. Moreover, only by first reaching this rank would the path towards the chief disciple be open and even a ranker in the future. Since the 10 Diamond Belt disciples have been decided, it's time for the most exciting part of the Diamond Belt selection. Yeah. The championship battle is next. I wonder what format this championship battle will take. I am really looking forward to it. No matter what format it is, I believe Ezra Zephyr has a very good chance. In fact, he will likely become the champion this time. That is not necessarily true. The reason why Ezra Zephyr was able to team wipe the Blood Slaughterer Peak disciples was because Umr and the gang were caught off guard, allowing Ezra to set up a boundary in secret. Since everyone now knows this trick of his, there is no way they will give him the time to set it up again in a fight. That's true. Without the help of the boundary, I don't see how Ezra could possibly match up to Elna, Isolde, and the other first-seat gold belt disciples. Many disciples discussed the outcome, their eyes filled with anticipation. The 10 Diamond Belt disciples before them were the top disciples who had distinguished themselves from all the gold belt disciples in their sect. And the champion would soon be decided from amongst them. One could only imagine how amazing the subsequent fights would be. Many disciples discussed the outcome, their eyes filled with anticipation. The 10 Diamond Belt disciples before them were the top disciples who had distinguished themselves from all the gold belt disciples in their sect. And the champion would soon be decided from amongst them. One could only imagine how amazing the subsequent fights would be. Novi.lbn The prince stood in front of a stone door as he stretched out his hand. The seals on the back of his hand began to flicker, before detaching themselves and flying into the stone door. After the seals entered, a rumbling noise immediately erupted from the stone door. Under Ezra Zephyr's excited gaze, the door slowly opened. Faint mist filled the area behind the stone door, while a tiny rock path extended towards the limits of one's sight. The championship battle, huh? Ezra's eyes glimmered. He would have no interest if it was just a title, as he was a very practical person. He was only interested in the championship prize, the spiritual moon pill. With that pill, he would be able to swiftly advance into the first level of the Foundation establishment stage. By doing so, he would increase his odds in the upcoming sect battle. The prince took in a deep breath, before he stepped past the stone door without the slightest trace of hesitation, embracing the mist as he began walking on that small cobbled path. The cobbled path brought him upwards. His surroundings were obscured by the fog, while his curious gaze remained directed to the front. He really wanted to know what the format of the championship battle would be. Was it going to be a 10-person brawl? As such thoughts swirled in his head, Ezra Zephyr's footsteps did not pause. After half an incense stick of time, he finally realized that he had reached the end of that cobbled path. Meanwhile, the mist in front of him began to dissipate. When the mist disappeared, a spacious rocky arena appeared in front of him. Ezra's gaze immediately locked onto the center of the arena, where a man was resting both his hands on the hilt of a dark gray sword, while his scabbard was propped up on the ground. Beside him was a 3-foot-long incense stick wedged atop a boulder. When Ezra saw this person, his pupils shrank slightly. The figure lifted his head and revealed a playful smile at the prince. "Ezra Zephyr, it seems like you've really made a name for yourself earlier. However, I never expected that you would bump into me." The prince frowned. The figure before him was not completely unknown. This person was also a disciple from Blood Slaughterer Peak, and seemed to be called Ajahn Pardo? Were they dispatching veteran Diamond Belt disciples for the championship battle? Looks like it was going to be quite a challenge. When the disciples outside the mountain range saw the prince ascend the peak and encounter Ajahn from Blood Slaughterer Peak, a commotion naturally ensued. To think that it would be senior brother Ajahn Pardo. This championship battle involves veteran Diamond Belt disciples? The other 9 have also been stopped by someone, all of whom are extremely powerful veteran Diamond Belt disciples from the various peaks. Could this championship battle be about who will be able to defeat these veteran Diamond Belt disciples? That's right. The championship battle shouldn't require them to defeat senior brother Ajahn and the rest. Many whispers echoed within the crowd. The format of the championship battle had clearly taken many by surprise. Atop one of the mountain peaks, Ella and the other girls were also watching the scenes inside the spiritual energy mirrors. Ajahn Pardo, from Blood Slaughterer Peak. A look of astonishment flashed across Ella Abella's gorgeous and icy face as she said, "It seems like Ezra Zephyr and Blood Slaughterer Peak are fated to be pit against one another. Can't believe he still managed to run into them after picking a path at random." A look of thought could be seen on her face as she continued, "To think that Sect Master and the rest would send out the veteran Purple Sash disciples. I believe the goal of this championship battle won't be for Ezra Zephyr and the rest to defeat their opponents, but how long they will be able to last against these veteran disciples." Ella looked at others and said, "If so, Ezra is quite the unlucky one. If it was anyone else from another peak, that person would likely hold back a little. However, there is no way that Ajahn Pardo will be showing any mercy. Therefore, Ezra's hopes of winning the championship might be dashed." At this point, she felt a little regretful for him. After all, she had personally witnessed how the prince had fought all the way to reach this juncture. Who could have imagined that he would encounter such a strong foe at the final stage? Elder Rilda's hands gently stroked Ella's shoulder. Her clear eyes gazed at the 2 figures facing each other in the spiritual mirror, as she slowly said, "Ella, you'll never know what's going to happen until the end." Ella was slightly shocked and responded with slight annoyance, "Elder, don't you think that you are blindly putting too much faith in Ezra? The reason why he was able to eliminate Umar and the rest was because they did not know about his hidden trump card, allowing him to lure them into the valley and set up a boundary. However, a genie's likely already aware of this information, and there is no way that he will allow Ezra to set up a boundary. Without the boundary, Ezra may not even be able to defeat Umar's entire team with his own strength, let alone Ajin, a veteran diamond belt expert. Ella was a fairly logical person. That was why she could not understand Elder Rilda's thoughts. She did not deny that Ezra was extremely outstanding. However, she believed that there were still limits. He was currently only at the 6th level stage, and if Elder Rilda believed that Ezra would be able to match Ajin in a clash of spiritual energy, she would be severely underestimating the one whole level gap between them. However, Elder Rilda was a seasoned elder of the sect and way more experienced. And this fact is what irritated Ella the most. While the area outside the mountain range was in an uproar, in the rocky arena, Ezra Zephyr wore a slightly unhappy expression as he stared at Ajin Pardo. The spiritual energy vibrations from the latter made him feel a significant amount of pressure. Peak level of core formation stage. Compared to Umar and the rest, this opponent was different. Ajin nonchalantly looked towards the prince, and unhurriedly said, "The last time we met, I respectfully gave you a way to apologize to junior sister Denise Tubble in order to resolve the grudge between the two of you. However, junior brother Ezra Zephyr, you were simply too arrogant and directly rejected my kind gesture. Therefore, in order to help junior brother Ezra Zephyr understand your situation, I made a request of junior brother Umar and the rest." Haha, of course, senior brother Wilson Sallow was also involved. Ezra Zephyr smiled a little. After all this time, it turns out that Umar and the rest had been on Ajin Pardo's instructions. Moreover, Wilson Sallow? Wasn't he the second ranker of Blood Slaughterer Peak? Why would he want to kill the prince? It seems like I've disappointed my two dumbass senior brothers, said Ezra Zephyr with indifference. Since the two of them were clearly intent on making life difficult for him, there is no way for Ezra would let this matter slide. Ajin Pardo nodded and sighed. Yes, I was indeed a little disappointed. I did not believe when I heard that Umar and the rest would be eliminated by you. Even till now, Ajin Pardo found this result quite difficult to accept. In his opinion, Umar and gang was already a powerful lineup. Ajin Pardo would never have expected them to be defeated by Ezra Zephyr. The prince sighed and stretched his back. You didn't watch the result of our fight, I believe? Did your discourser tell you the details? Ajin grasped the handle of his sword with both hands, as its scabbard gently knocked on the ground. Indifference returned to his eyes as he said, "The details mean nothing, since you have showed up in front of me, you no longer need to think about passing this stage. In order for my Blood Slaughterer Peak to regain some of its pride, I will need to give you a good thrashing. If you still have a bit of rationality within you, I suggest that you surrender now. Otherwise..." Ajin gently smiled, before he continued, "Don't blame this senior for bullying you in order to teach you how to abide by the unspoken rules." The prince yawned and made a grabbing motion. In next moment, the purple hook promptly appeared in his hand. Not a single ripple could be seen in his clear eyes as he lifted his head and looked towards Ajin Pardo. "Then let's talk about the rules. Is the objective of the championship battle to defeat you?" Ajin Pardo was taken aback, before he soon burst into laughter. However, his eyes turned colder and colder as a derisive smile appeared on his lips. "Junior brother, it seems like your earlier victory has made you lose your rationality." Ajin pointed at that 3 feet long and 2 feet wide rectangular clock behind him and said, "Right now, the top 10 disciples of the selection will each encounter a veteran diamond belt disciple from the 7 peaks. The winner of the championship battle will hinge upon which of you will be able to last the longest. After 2 hours, the one who is left standing will be the champion. Therefore, junior brother Ezra Zephyr, what you should be thinking about now is not how to defeat me, but how long I will allow you to last. Truthfully speaking, we are initially supposed to go easy on all of you such as to give face to the various peaks, allowing all of you participants to last a little longer, and maintain some sense of dignity. However..." Ajin Pardo shrugged, his eyes turning a little colder as he stared at Ezra Zephyr and said, "My plan is to make you the first one to be eliminated. By this point, it was clear that Ajahn Pardo was not going to show any mercy. As for going easy on Ezra Zephyr, that was even more impossible. A grim expression filled Ezra's eyes, as Dripa in his hand rapidly shone. Its sharp small purple blades was pointed towards the ground at an angle, while black lightning rose to the sky like a rod of bolt. The loud sound of thunderclaps seemed to echo from within the lightning's spiritual energy. Your sorry existence will be used to set an example for all. Do your best to survive these 2 hours. Ezra Zephyr slowly said. Not a single hint of fear could be seen in his eyes. Instead, a wicked grin appeared on his face. His opponent was indeed very powerful, but Ezra Zephyr was a calamity in humanoid shape. In his opinion, every strong enemy was a whetstone he would use to build his power. At the sight of Ezra Zephyr, who was overflowing with killing intent, the derisive smile on Ajahn Pardo's lips widened. I sincerely hope that you will be able to keep up this spirit later on. The sword in his hand suddenly slashed behind him, causing tearing noises to be emitted from the air. She. The rectangular clock behind him started, a loud ticking sound. Ajahn wielded his sword with one hand, while the expression in his eyes abruptly sharpened. A giant wave of dark green spiritual energy shot out from his head and soared into the sky. His spiritual energy was akin to a giant green sword that towered between sky and earth. A sharp and intimidating pressure swept forth, as the cry of a sword filled the sky. Ezra, you made my blood slaughterer peak lose plenty of face earlier. It's now time for payback. An enormous dark green spiritual energy pillar rose into the sky, stirring the wind and clouds as a powerful sword aura pulsed from it, causing the entire area to be filled with the cry of a sword. Ajahn Pardo immediately displayed the astonishing might of a peak 7th level core formation stage. The expression on Ezra Zephyr's face remained same as he tightened his grip on the purple hook. When Ajahn Pardo's spiritual energy charged into the sky, 9 other powerful spiritual energy pillars also erupted on the other 9 peaks, each one reaching the strength of the peak level core formation stage. Evidently, the fights on the other 9 peaks had also begun. However, compared to Ajahn spiritual energy, the other 9 powerful spiritual energy pillars seemed to be holding back a little. Just like what Ajahn Pardo had said earlier, they were purposefully holding back out of consideration for their junior brothers and sisters. However, it was clear that Ajahn Pardo had no intentions of doing so. In fact, even the many disciples outside the mountain range could detect this as well. However, they could only sigh in pity with regards to this. Ezra Zephyr was truly unfortunate. Out of all the possible opponents, he just had to bump into Ajahn from Blood Slaughterer Peak. Anyone else would have most likely gone easy on Ezra. Around the river, Lycrus was watching the fight. He lifted his head to look at that powerful spiritual energy that had erupted from a certain mountain peak, as a look of hatred flashed in her eyes. He had lost all face in front of Ella Abella earlier. Though he resented him, he was also very fearful of her. The heartless ferocity in Ella's eyes earlier as he thrust his brush towards him had sent a chill through his heart. As a result, he no longer had the courage to oppose Ezra Zephyr before Ella. However, it seemed that Ezra had finally used up all of his blessings. To think that he would be unlucky enough to encounter Ajahn. Ezra, it's too early for you to become Diamond Belt. Senior brother Ajahn will make you understand how stupid it is to offend our Blood Slaughterer Peak. Don't even think about advancing any further in this selection. As for the championship title, you can dream on. On the mountain peak, Ajahn sneered as he suddenly slammed his palms together. SWWOSH. That 100-foot-tall dark green energy pillar suddenly split apart, transforming into dozens of light rays as they fell from the sky. Each ray was in the shape of a sword, pulsing with an incomparably sharp aura as they descended. Their speed was as quick as lightning. The sound of rushing wind echoed from above Ezra. His figure instantly etherealized as he quickly retreated like a wisp of smoke. Boom boom. Streaks of dark green spiritual energy viciously rained down. They struck the ground like giant swords, leaving deep scars behind. N/-0 vel B1N. Every blast of green spiritual energy that landed would give rise to a destructive shockwave. Meanwhile, Ezra Zephyr was akin to a leaf boat floating on the waves, wobbling precariously at every gust of wind. His surroundings were filled with danger, and a single slip was all it would take to capsize him. The final stream of green energy landed. Ezra Zephyr's feet slid across the ground, leaving 2 long trails upon it. His expression was extremely grim, because there were now numerous small wounds on the surface of his body. These wounds had been caused by the sword aura from the green spiritual energy. "Oh, you managed to scratch my skin. That's more than what I expected of a veteran diamond belt disciple." The prince wiped off the blood on the back of his hand. Not only did Ajahn show strong and robust spiritual energy, but his energy was extremely sharp. As such, his energy was able to invade the opponent's body at even the slightest contact. If not for the fact that Ezra Zephyr's body was of a higher grade, just the sword-like spiritual energy that invaded his body alone would give him a huge headache. According to his estimates, Ajahn Pardo should have a grade 6 armament-type martial spirit. Upon seeing that Ezra's martial spirit had not been disrupted even with the many wounds on his body, Ajahn raised his brows and said, "Your body is quite high quality, to think that you are able to withstand my piercing spiritual energy." It was clear that Ezra Zephyr had neutralized all the spiritual energy that had invaded his body. But this is even better. I need not worry about breaking you. The corners of Ajahn Pardo's mouth raised slightly, filled with a chilling sensation. His foot slammed into the ground the instant his words faded. Boom. Green spiritual energy swept forth from under his feet like a shock wave, spreading across the entire arena in the blink of an eye. Million Minimeter swords. The green spiritual energy vibrated as it seemed to unravel, transforming into innumerable tiny hair-like green sword light. A split second later, hundreds of millions of sword light shot towards Ezra Zephyr. In the face of this attack, Ezra stayed calm as a tree. He gazed upon the green sword light that seemed to fill the sky and land. Ezra's pupils shrank slightly. His body immediately gossamer, turning slightly transparent. Gossamer steps. The prince didn't use dragon pelt, neither did he take off any of his weight bracers. The spiritual energy and martial spirit of Ajahn were weird, possessing a remarkable penetrating effect. The prince did not stop after that. He rolled up his black coat sleeves as something shone under the bracer of his arm. It was an imprint. The imprint flickered with a glossy glow, a sign that it had been prepared some time ago. Glassy oil body imprint. In the wake of his yell, the rune instantly began to spread, as an oil-like look surged out and enveloped Ezra's body. The current Ezra Zephyr looked like a man dipped in oil. The only difference was that his body was not wet. However, his defensive power had become shockingly terrifying. "This should be more than enough," mumbled the prince with a smile. At the pavilion outside, Elder Lo spoke. "Elder Song, what is that rune? Do we have its formation at our peak?" A few seconds passed and there was no response, forcing Elder Lo to will his head, and what he saw was not the usual Elder Song. The current one was astounded, with his mouth agape and eyes widened. Clang clang. The countless tiny green sword lights arrived just as Ezra Zephyr had finished his preparations. Crisp and clear sounds of collision echoed in the mountain peak. Like a storm of green swords was violently raining down upon the land. Outside the mountain range, numerous disciples swallowed when they saw the scene. The fights on the other 9 peaks were still in the warm-up phase, while Ezra Zephyr and Ajahn Pardo had already unleashed their killing intent, showing no mercy against each other. A disciple sighed and said, "Ajahn is too vicious. The fight has only just begun, and yet he has already unleashed his signature move, million millimeter swords. Even normal diamond belt disciples would have no choice but to retreat if they were up against this attack. He has no choice." Ezra eliminated the entire Blood Slaughterer Peak team previously. Therefore, Ajahn Pardo must thoroughly thrash the prince in order to restore some dignity for his peak. I wonder if Ezra Zephyr will survive this barrage. Anyone want to bet? Odds are 5 to 1, you can earn big time if Ezra wins. I bet on junior brother Ezra Zephyr. What? Are you nuts? Haha, are you afraid that senior brother Ajahn would lose? Hell no, let's make a bet. 500 spirit stones. I bet 200 on Senior Agent Pardo. I bet 700 on Ezra Zephyr. Wayo. 700 is not a small number. Soon after, the outside turned into a betting den. Tens of thousands of disciples bet on Agent Pardo, while merely a few thousand bet on Ezra, of which, most were from the Bloodfang army. Amidst the numerous whispers, the rain of tiny green swords slowly began to thin, before finally ceasing. Countless gazes immediately looked over. Countless holes had been poked into the ground. Though each hole was the size of a little finger, they were completely pitch black, and it was impossible to see to the bottom. At the center of the destruction, Ezra Zephyr stood with his arms crossed in front of him. Needle-like green sword light seemed to cover every inch of his body, making him look similar to a hedgehog. It was a painful sight to behold. Agent Pardo's eyes narrowed as he stared at this scene. Brutal. A soft bubble sound was heard from Ezra Zephyr's body. The oil-like cover swiftly began to fall. As it flowed, the tiny green sword stuck in the oily cover also fell off. A few seconds passed. The entire oily cover had fallen off, returning Ezra's body to its original color. There were a few small needle-like holes on his body, blood was peeping out of them. The holes could be counted on fingers. Seeing that his attack failed miserably, he snorted as he mocked, "Your snail shell is really tough." These were merely superficial wounds. With his gossamer steps and the defensive rune, Ezra had managed to block the brunt of the onslaught. This made Agent's expression turn rather ugly. He had initially thought that this move would be enough to leave Ezra Zephyr helpless on the ground,